Chapter 821. The layer of ice was thicker than he had imagined. Fortunately, in Brando's opinion, the so-called 10,000-year-old glacier was only slightly more solid than glass. With a strength that was thousands of times greater than that of an ordinary person, and the mastery of the most fundamental law of this world, the so-called solidity of the mortal world, had become a relative concept here. However, Brando did not dare to bombard the ice with a strength that was hundreds of times greater than that of an ordinary person. Techniques such as piercing strike and Medish's attack of 1,000 armies could cause a large collapse of the ice wall, but it was more likely to cause a second collapse, and then completely seal them in this cold and dark underground. Therefore, he could only cut off the ice layer by layer, and he had to avoid the weakest parts of the structure. Sometimes, after digging for dozens of feet, he would find that the ice was like broken glass stacked together. Even if he cursed his bad luck in his heart, he could only change direction and continue. No one dared to gamble with their lives. Ball of Light was a first circle spell of the air element, lasting for a fixed time of half an hour. Kohua's spell was extinguished twice during this time, but the eldest daughter of Ekis was amazingly well behaved. She did not need to be reminded, nor did she make any small movements, and would naturally add another spell. She was like an obedient noble girl who had been educated by the upper class, rather than the eldest daughter of Ekis, the head of the monsters that made people pale. Brando was fine, as there were many rumors about this young lady in his previous life, but Erek looked at Kohua again and again, and was extremely uncomfortable. But in fact, Kohua's dark side was her nature as the eldest daughter of Ekis. It was unknown where her soul came from. For Brando, cutting the ice layer was purely physical work, without any skills, and was extremely tiring. He dug a tunnel that only allowed one person to pass through, and after digging forward for about 150 meters, of course there were countless detours along the way, he was already exhausted and had to change to rest. Erek snorted in disdain and went up. Although he was a soldier, he had learned systematic magic skills after joining All for One. Although it was not as outrageous as elemental activation, it was more than enough to burn the ice. Usually when a mage fought a swordsman there was nothing fancy about it. The speed of the swordsman was so fast that the mage had no choice but to use the most basic spells to end the battle. Therefore, when a wizard or an elementalist fought a swordsman, it was usually a contest of pure strength. The winner would be decided within a few rounds. However, in all aspects other than combat, spellcasters still had a huge advantage. It was no wonder that Erek laughed at Brando. He cast a few fire spells and directly melted a tunnel in the ice. His speed was at least several times faster than Brando's. Unfortunately, the Duke's complacency didn't last long. He had only cast a few spells, and he was already panting. He couldn't help but be surprised. Logically speaking, even though the stamina of adepts had always been a problem, it shouldn't be to the extent of falling ill after casting a few spells. Erek was puzzled, but it was Brando who reacted first. The reason was the air. There was not much air in the cave, and Erek still cast a fire spell. Wasn't this suicidal? After being ridiculed by Brando, even the thick-skinned Duke couldn't help but blush. He had to change to other spells to cut the ice layer. He finally chose the Wind Blade, which was the same choice as Brando's, and earned him a lot of ridicule. Because he didn't have an advantage in the end, Erek's distance was not as far as Brando's. He dug forward for 100 meters, and then retreated dizzily. His strength was already far inferior to Brando's, not to mention that a wizard's casting consumed more energy than a warrior swinging a sword. After the two retreated, it was Kohua's turn. Originally, Brando suggested that he and Erek would take turns, and Kohua only needed to maintain the light. After all, if two big men were to let a little girl replace them, not to mention Brando, even Erek would feel a little embarrassed. No matter how fanatical Erek was, he was still from the upper class. With his education, in fact, even two Brandos would not be able to catch up. However, what surprised the two was that the seemingly delicate Miss Kohua had power beyond their imagination. They didn't see this young lady use any means, but they saw the layers of ice disappear layer by layer. Her speed of advancement was more than 10 times faster than Erek's, and even Brando could only look on in the dust. The two were so surprised that they gave up their hostility and asked what means she used, but Kohua only used 2 words to shut them up: divine power. They could only keep their mouths shut. Ko Hua had the purest bloodline of the Twilight tribe. Although the Twilight Dragon was chaotic, it was also a manifestation of the rules. It was actually reasonable to say that it was a god. Below it, Ekis was a real ancient god, but he didn't belong to the same god system as Martha. Ekis's daughters from Ko Hua to Jin Hai were all demigods. This was also known by Brando. Divine power, on the other hand, was the power of existence. Brando could see it, but it was unattainable. Arek looked at the ice path opened by Ko Hua and was silent for a while. The Duke seemed to be thinking about something. After a while, he turned around and glanced at Brando. "Count Tonajul, what are you thinking about?" Brando was slightly stunned. He was thinking about the Shire, Medisha, and Hippamera. There had been no news of the three of them since the collapse of the Spiral Hall. He didn't know if they were dead or if this place blocked spiritual communication. Brando convinced himself that it might be because of the latter reason, because Medisha, the Shire, and the others were not only outstanding in strength, but also had rich experience. They were stronger than Arek, and if even Arek could survive, even if the three of them were unlucky, they wouldn't be buried under the glacier together. There was no response from the other side, which could only mean that this place blocked spiritual communication. Moreover, this was the land of eternal rest of gods. According to the game, this was the core of the boss area, so it was normal for there to be some special effects. After all, there was a constant dimensional anchor outside the Spiral Hall. However, he was more worried about the little prince. The little prince's strength was not even a silver. If he accidentally lost the little prince here, Princess Griffine would definitely tear him apart. Of course, the princess might not be a match for him now, but Brando didn't want her to hate him for the rest of her life. He was annoyed, but he didn't expect Arek to take the initiative to talk to him. This was simply a fantasy. Although they had communicated before, it was limited to, ignorant. Stupid. You burned all the air here. Are you planning to die with me? You're measuring the heart of a gentleman with your own mean measure. These kinds of meaningless lines. Brando couldn't help but look at Arek strangely. "I'm a little curious," Arek said without waiting for Brando's reply. "With your ability and strength at such a young age, where can't you make a name for yourself? I heard that woman Veronica had extended an olive branch to you in the loop of trade winds. You have no background, so you'll be greatly valued in the Empire. Isn't it better than messing up the situation in Erewhon?" "Oh," Arek suddenly added, "I forgot that you're Darius' grandson, but with Darius's relationship with the Wind Elves, you'll be a real count in Saint Tossel with just a word. If I remember correctly, you're just a count now. You even have to fight for your own land. What's the difference between you and those cheap knights in the Holy Cathedral?" The old man shook his head as he spoke. He obviously couldn't understand why Brando had to stay in Erewhon to make things difficult for him. After a short period of interaction, he was almost certain that without Brando, the outcome of the battle in Ampere Seal might have been very different. Brendel glanced at this guy. He didn't expect him to still be daydreaming at this time. He simply didn't understand why this guy would go bankrupt for the sake of all for one, and even make himself so miserable. His butt was sitting a little too crooked. However, he really couldn't answer Arek's question. His reason for staying in Erewhon was a little strange. If he said it out loud, it would probably anger the Duke to death. After all, 2 or 3 of the reasons were actually to go against the Duke. Nationalism was not unfamiliar to the players, but it was still a little too advanced for the people of Erewhon and Cruz in this era. Erewhon was basically the country with the most embryonic form of nationalism in Wond. This was related to the process and history of the kingdom. But even so, the people of Erewhon were still willing to accept the governance of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. They were even willing to admit that they were descendants of the Flame King like the people of Cruz. It was just that their ideals were different. But for Brando, he was very disgusted with the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Most of the players were almost the same as him. In their view, Erewhon was Erewhon and Cruz was Cruz. The concept of a country was much clearer to the players. But these reasons couldn't be explained to Arek, so he looked at the Duke with some contempt and didn't answer. Arek misunderstood something and shook his head. "It's normal for young people to admire power. I can understand why you would rather be the head of a chicken than the tail of a cow. But even if you become the regent of Erewhon, what can you do? You won't receive much more praise than you do now. People may respect you, But that's because of the power in your hands. At the end of time, all of this will still turn to dust. I think you should look further ahead. There is something in this world called truth. Brando was dizzy when he heard this. This guy actually wanted to develop him into a believer of All for One at this time. This was simply crazy. However, All for One was still very attractive to some people in this world because Won did have some mysterious existence. On Earth, right and wrong were just a definition of human beings, but here it was one of the reasons for the existence of laws. Some lunatics, such as Arek, pursued these things all their lives. But Brando sneered at this. He was about to say something sarcastic, but it was at this time that his ears suddenly twitched and he heard some strange movements. He immediately waved his hand to quiet Arek and then reminded, "Miss Ko-hwa, please stop for a moment." The sound came from afar and Ko-hwa's side stopped. When it was quiet under the glacier, Brando finally heard the sound. It was like the squeaking of a saw cutting wood, or someone plowing through the glacier with an iron plow. The sound was very soft at first, but slowly became louder and louder, and even Arek could hear it clearly. The Duke's expression changed. This sound is somewhat familiar. Brando also felt that the sound was very familiar. The sound was very rhythmic, moving forward bit by bit, stopping after a while, and then moving forward again a few minutes later. After a while, Ko-hwa ran out of the ice path and said to the two, "The sound is in front of us." "It's moving towards us?" asked Brando. Ekis' eldest daughter nodded. "Can we turn around?" Brando asked. He suddenly had a bad premonition. "I'm afraid it's too late. It should have heard our voices before coming over," replied Ko-hwa. Brando immediately turned to look at Arek. The Duke had been talking loudly under the ice cave, but he had forgotten that there might be something under the glacier. Of course, the main problem now was that they didn't know what it was. Anything could be under this 10,000-year-old glacier. It would be fine if they encountered those fierce monsters, but the most terrible thing was that they wouldn't even be able to run away if they encountered those indescribable things. The entire Won's surface was the famous beehive, and the glacier was no exception. Brando didn't know what was down there, but he knew that it was an area after level 90. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but glare at Arek. Arek felt embarrassed, so he didn't say a word. However, he had lost a lot of face in the past day, so he only had a dark expression on his face. The three of them were stunned for a moment before they heard the sound of ice cracking in front of them. As if to make up for his stupidity, Duke Arek reacted quickly and suggested, "We can dig an ice path to the side and hide in it. The opening is narrower. The monsters under the glacier are usually very large, so it's good for storing fat. I suggest we let Miss Ko-hwa do this. Among the three of us, she's the only one who won't make a sound when she does it." Brando nodded. This was similar to his idea, but Arek's knowledge surprised him. Won's terrain was very varied, and the monsters under different terrains were very different. Judging from the Duke's tone, he seemed to be very familiar with it. They hurriedly retreated to a distance of 34 meters, opened 8-shaped path on the ice wall, and then hid in it one by one. Korfa, being a lady, naturally took up a space by herself, and Brando could only squeeze in with his enemy Arek. Before Brando retreated into the side path, he specially fixed the entrance of the ice path so that it looked like a natural crack. He had learned this trick in the game, and he was the best at it among the three of them. Even Ekis' eldest daughter couldn't do it. Not long after the three of them hid in the side path, they heard the sound of something being dragged in front of them. It sounded like layers of ice were breaking like glass, and then collapsing to both sides. The sound was so loud that Brando couldn't help but be speechless. The monster's size must be amazing. Although it was as Arek said, most of the monsters under the glacier were huge in order to store fat, it was still rare for them to be this big. The sound soon came to the vicinity, and the sound of ice peeling was almost deafening. Brando wanted to stretch his head out to see what it was. If he was still a player, he would definitely do so. Dying was just a loss of a level, but the curiosity of a player was more than the level difference. But for now, he could only hold it in, until he suddenly saw Korfa's small mouth opening and closing, telling him something. He was slightly startled, but he immediately reacted. He saw what Ko-hwa was going to say. For words. Frost Devourer teeth. Damn, Brando finally knew what it was outside. It was the damn Frost Devourer King. Brando's hair stood on end. The main battlefield of these things was under the glacier. He had seen the Frost Devourer King once before in the Spiral Hall, and the meat grinder-like teeth left a deep impression on him. That thing wasn't something that Maine and Mir, who had just awoken from their eternal slumber and were still in a weakened state, could compare to. It was unknown how many years it had lived under the glacier, and its strength could only be described as terrifying. Moreover, the key point was that its size made ordinary attacks completely ineffective. Brando knew that in the game, it was necessary to rely on the terrain of the glacier. The large guilds used siege weapons such as magic ballistas to defeat this terrifying monster leader. This was also the setting of the game itself. To deal with this thing under the glacier with bare hands, Brando thought for a while. He estimated that he had to find a dozen level 130 warriors like himself to solve the problem. Moreover, under the glacier was the terrain that the Frost Devourer King was best at. Their mobility and perception in this place were far stronger than on the ground. Brando suddenly began to wonder if they would be discovered by that thing if they hid in this place. But fortunately, it seemed that Martha was still on their side. The Frost Devourer King slid its body slowly outside the side passage. It didn't seem to notice that there were 3 little mice hiding here. It patrolled and gradually went away. Brando suddenly thought that the direction of the Frost Devourer King might be the big glacier outside the Eternal Extinction Square. This Frost Devourer King should have escaped at this time, and then it became the famous boss of the Holy Cathedral of the Hibernator. But at this moment he didn't have a sudden realization in his heart. He only felt that his whole body was soaked in cold sweat. Beside him, the once arrogant Grand Duke Arek also had the same thought. His face was pale and he didn't even dare to breathe. The 3 of them heard that the Frost Devourer King was getting farther and farther away, and their hearts became more and more settled. Especially Brando suddenly thought that after the Frost Devourer King left, it would definitely leave a long tunnel, which would save them a lot of effort. This tunnel might lead to the underground of the Spiral Hall because the Frost Devourer Fong should have been locked in that place. Brando was daydreaming when he suddenly saw Ko Hua talking to him again. What is he talking about this time? Brando was slightly startled. He saw Ekka's eldest daughter opening and closing her mouth, but the meaning this time was much more difficult to understand than the last time. Above? What above? Brando looked up inexplicably, and his face suddenly turned pale, because he saw that the ceiling of the side tunnel they dug was extending a long crack, and the blue ice surface was gradually turning white, which was a sign before it collapsed. Damn, Brando also screamed in his heart. What should I do now? Should I escape or stay here? If I escape, I will have to face the Frost Devourer King. If I stay here, the collapse of the glacier is not a joke. He was sweating profusely as he made a choice, but the speed of the glacier cracking was faster than he imagined. Before he could speak, there was a sudden crashing sound, and the ice layer above had already fallen. But to Brando's surprise, what fell was not the thick ice that completely buried them under the ice layer, but a thin layer of ice wall, and then a few people fell from above. Ouch! It hurts. When Brando heard the voice, he was ecstatic. It was the voice of the little prince. But before he could rejoice, his expression changed drastically. He reached out and pulled the guy who had fallen into his arms, hurriedly covering his mouth. The little prince obviously did not expect that there would be people below. He was inexplicably pulled by Brando and was shocked. He looked back in surprise and shouted, "Teacher? Woo woo woo." And it was at this moment Brando felt that the Frost Devourer King outside had stopped. This big guy definitely did not stop suddenly to have a tea party or something. It must have sensed something. As for what it sensed, it was hard to say. Brando hugged the little prince who was crying and only felt that his back was already cold. How can I be so unlucky, Your Highness, little prince? Aren't you tricking your teacher? He wanted to cry but had no tears. P.S. Second update. This chapter is 6,000 words. This is already the 4th day of more than 10,000 consecutive updates. It's National Day. I didn't even go to Hazy's party to make up for the time I stopped updating for so long. Students, for the sake of my hard work, give me some effort and continue to ask for vote. Chapter 822. Haru's eyes widened. He finally saw that the person who covered his mouth was his teacher, the Count of Tonajal, and subconsciously shut his mouth. At this time, Brando also saw the other people who fell. The second and third ones who rolled down were Faraz and Lorena, and then another figure slid down and sat on them. Faraz, who was sitting at the bottom, groaned. It was Miss Scholar holding a thick diary. She rolled down from the female knight and plunged into the snow, crying out in pain. The last one was a tall guy, but he was a little unlucky and hit his head on the ice. Brando looked at the man who got up with a red forehead and recognized him as Prince Lenoret. Mr. Brando! My lord! Faraz and Shido immediately cried out in surprise when they saw Brando clearly. Brando looked at the two a little resentfully, but he didn't bother to tell them to be quiet because the sound of iron plows plowing through ice was coming back from afar. It was too late to say anything now, they had to run immediately. Brando let go of His Highness the Little Prince, pulled out Halran Gaia and came to the side entrance, staring at the back half of the Frost Devourer that was wriggling backward. He hesitated for a moment, roughly calculating how many chances there were, but finally said, Miss Ko Hua, I'll leave this side to you. Please open a passage immediately, I'll block it for a moment. No problem, Mr. Human. Ko Hua nodded immediately and began to prepare to cast a spell. The little prince seemed to finally realize the trouble he had caused and looked at Brando with a pale face. Brando looked back at his bewildered student and sighed. He had never been a teacher to anyone in his life and cherished his only student very much, not to mention that the other party was Erwin's heir and the future king. He patted Haruz on the shoulder to reassure him. The little prince had grown a lot after experiencing the dream, and the previous situation was not all his fault. Anyone in that situation would have reacted the same way. He judged others by his own standards and felt that he couldn't force it anymore. Haruz, however, looked very excited. He took a deep breath and said, Teacher, I'll stay with you. Don't mess around, remember who you are and act like a man, okay? I won't tell Her Highness about your childish words just now. Although fighting side by side with the future king's student sounded very tempting, especially in the next battle of life and death, he believed that it would leave a deep impression on Haruz. But Brando didn't want to die. He calculated the script, he had a chance of dealing with the Frost Devourer alone, but with a burden he was dead meat. Besides, he didn't need his influence in Haruz's heart. When the little prince heard Brando mention his sister, his face suddenly changed and he didn't dare to say another word. He was afraid of his sister to the extent that a mouse was afraid of a cat. Brando glanced back, looking for someone reliable to protect Haruz. He first looked at Filas and Lorena, then shook his head. This pair was too unreliable. But Shido couldn't do it either. The scholar herself was still a young lady who had to rely on others for external affairs, not to mention she had no ability to protect people. Finally, his eyes fell on Prince Lenoret, hesitated for a moment and said, Your Royal Highness, I now officially entrust the future crown prince of our country to your protection. I believe in the credibility of the Kurlutz royal family. Surely you won't let me down? Lenoret was slightly startled. He glanced at Haruz standing next to Brando and nodded. Brando breathed a sigh of relief. Although the nobles and Wond often schemed against each other, the relationship between the royal families was actually relatively good. After all, they had several common enemies. One was the feudal lords, the second was the powerful religious forces, and finally the royal families often intermarried with each other, so they were more or less related. However, the fact that the eldest prince of Cruz dared to use the credibility of the Cruz royal family as a guarantee improved Brando's impression of his originally arrogant attitude. At least now it proved that he had the right to be proud. As the heir to a huge empire, he was not a soft-footed shrimp who dared not take responsibility. Brando then thought that the eldest prince might be planning to rope in Erwin. After all, he had been close to Haruz from the beginning. But this had nothing to do with him. He looked at Arek. Duke, you stay with me. Arek didn't even lift his eyelids and snorted, but he didn't refute. He probably understood that Brando didn't believe him, and wouldn't let him stay with the young prince. In that case, he didn't bother to waste his breath. In just a few words, the purple-red fat body of the Frost Devourer Worm King had shrunk back to the last part. Through the ice, the huge mouth part dragged at the front could be seen dimly. After Brando instructed the others, he walked to the side of the road. Without saying a word, he raised his sword and slashed at one of the rings of the Frost Devourer Worm King. To his surprise, the dark blade of the Halrangaya easily cut into the body of the frost devourer worm, but it felt as if it had cut into a layer of oily skin. The thick skin was so tough that it didn't cut through. Instead, the blade almost bounced back. Brando was stunned. The Halrangaya was a holy sword, and the person who used the sword had the strength of elemental activation. He slashed it with all his strength, but there wasn't even a white mark. Not to mention a white mark, there wasn't even a dent. It was as if the skin had recovered the moment the blade was bounced back. What kind of perverted defense is this? It wasn't just Brando. At this moment, Ko Hua's spell was not ready yet, and the others hiding in the side tunnel also saw this scene. Everyone was shocked. Even if they didn't know what sword Brando was holding in his hand, Brando's strength was there for all to see. He was the most outstanding genius in the continent for nearly 1,000 years. He had elemental activation at the age of 20, and he was also the new sword saint candidate of Erwin's generation. He slashed with all his strength, but the fat worm's skin didn't even break. "Count," Shido's face was pale and she apologized profusely. "I'm sorry, it's all our fault." She thought that it was the sound of them falling that attracted the worm. Of course, this guess was actually not far from the truth. It was just that the real culprit was not her, but the little prince beside Brando. Brando waved his hand to her, indicating that it was okay. He took a step back, white light gathered on his sword, and then he slashed again. This time Brando used the piercing strike technique. The attribute of breaking through defense finally took effect. This sword opened a long bloody wound on the Frost Devourer Worm King. Of course, this long wound was relative to them. For this boss, it was no different from being scratched by a needle. However, the severe pain still made the Frost Devourer jump up violently. It let out a painful howl, and the ring of its body arched out of the ice tunnel and hit the ceiling. Once, twice. Brando felt like an earthquake, and the broken ice on top of his head fell straight down. "Okay, Mr. Human." At this time, Ko Hua suddenly shouted happily. She finally finished casting the mysterious spell. The ice wall disappeared layer by layer in front of her like a magic trick. The girl walked forward and immediately eroded a long tunnel under the glacier. "You guys continue, I'll attract its attention for a while," Brando said to the others while holding the shaking cave wall with one hand. After the Frost Devourer was stimulated by the severe pain, it no longer retreated. Instead, it turned around and pounced on them. The ice was like water to it, unable to stop it at all. When it moved forward, it opened its mouth, and the tens of thousands of teeth in its big mouth could dig a big hole under the ice with just a bite. The sound of the ice cracking sounded in front of him, and Brando's scalp tingled. He glanced to the side. Haruz was the first to enter the tunnel, followed by Shido, Lorena, and Filas, and finally the eldest prince of the Cruz people. Seeing this scene, Brando had a good impression of him. He was not afraid in the face of danger. This guy still had some sense of responsibility, but Brando thought about it. Lenoret was a famous figure in history, and His Majesty the most famous emperor for decades after the Cruz people was certainly not an ordinary person. After everyone entered the tunnel, only Brando and Arek were left. Brando could not enter the tunnel, and Ko Hua's speed of digging with magic was definitely not as fast as the Frost Devourer. If he went in too, everyone would be finished together in the end. He had to stay and attract the monster's attention for a while, and then find a way to slip out of the tunnel. But soon Brando felt that he was being a little too heroic. In front of him, the ice was cracking layer by layer. It looked like a snow-white rose was blooming under the blue ice, but both of them knew that it was not a rose, but more and more cracks under the ice. Finally, layers of cracks floated to the surface of the ice, causing the ice to bulge with a crack, and then burst apart, splashing forward. Brando only saw a blur in front of him, and countless teeth seemed to grow out of the ice wall in front of him, spinning and pouncing on him. All the ice was swallowed back into those teeth, and then a squirming mouthpiece was revealed. Just the size of this mouthpiece made him look up. Brando felt the stench, but he also knew that this was the king of the Frost Devourer. Arek, don't play tricks if you want to live. At this point there was no way to retreat. Brando could only summon all his courage, roar, and stab the monster's upper jaw. The squirming mouth was like a concentric circle from the outside to the inside, and each layer was made up of countless sharp teeth. The direction that Brando's sword pierced was the upper half of this circular mouth. He had already tested the defense of this thing, so he did not hesitate to use a piercing strike. The blade was facing upwards, and the sword pierced into the huge mouth, almost reaching the hilt. A stream of pus and blood gushed down from above, almost drenching Brando's face. This sword could be said to have exhausted Brando's courage. He was now almost standing in the monster's mouth. As long as the monster closed its mouth regardless of the pain, there would be no Count Tonagel in Woan tomorrow, only the excrement of the Frost Devourer. Fortunately, the excrement of the Frost Devourer was some substance similar to ice crystals. It was colorless and odorless, so it was not too disgusting. But now it was hard for Brando to say whether his gamble was right or not. He held the hilt of the sword tightly with one hand, and the other hand pressed on the monster's upper jaw full of sharp teeth. Fortunately, he was wearing Bahamut's blessing, and the magic gauntlet protected his hand from being pierced into a sieve. At the same time, he used his foot to press against the monster's lower jaw to prevent it from closing its mouth. Unfortunately, the flesh gauntlet had been completely scrapped in the Battle of Ampere Seal. Now he was only wearing a pair of ordinary military boots, which did not have a metal sole for anti-slip purposes. Under this step, Brando understood what it meant to have 10 fingers linked to the heart, although he now knew that this word could also be used to describe the foot. He felt that the soles of his feet were completely pierced, and the pain was almost convulsing. Fortunately, the monster was not any better than him. Its upper jaw was pierced by the Halrangaya, and the pain was so painful that it wanted to roll around in this ice path. It desperately wanted to swallow the little thing stuck in its mouth, but unfortunately, Brando was not to be trifled with. His vision turned black, and he had already activated the Berserk talent. Under the double strength amplitude, the Frost Devourer did not succeed. Brando knew very well that the Frost Devourer was strong in defense, so the players needed to use the magic ballista to deal with it. But its attack power was at the level of the average boss at this stage or even weaker. Otherwise, this battle would be impossible to fight, and the players would probably complain to the game company. It was the same here. Brando felt that this monster's attack power might only be slightly stronger than in the game, but it was also limited. At this stage in the game, the tanks who had not yet reached the level of elemental activation could withstand this boss. There was no reason why he, a warrior with elemental activation and the double strength amplitude of the Berserk talent, could not hold this big guy back. It was just that the tanks in the game had a complete team of healers behind them, but he did not have one here. He knew very well that he could not fight a protracted battle with this thing, or he would definitely be finished. Arek, what are you waiting for? Of course, Arek was not waiting, but even he could not help but be a little dumbfounded at this moment. The huge mouth of several people's height was in front of him, and the densely packed teeth reminded him of the barbed winches in his underground torture chamber. This huge mouth had now become a flattened oval, and Brando was trapped inside. Of course, he knew that Count Tonagel was waiting for him to make a move, but at this moment the old fox's expression kept changing. He knew very well that at this time, as long as he made a move from behind, the opponent would be dead. But the problem was that the truth was also in front of him. As long as Brando died, he would definitely be next. This Frost Devourer obviously did not understand the principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If teleportation spells could still be used, he could consider leaving Brando behind and running away, but the problem was that since entering the promenade of meditation, almost the entire area of the spiral hall was completely covered by the constant dimensional anchor. The so-called teleportation spells were just wishful thinking. He sighed. The other party had obviously thought this through and dared to leave his back to him. Unless he risked everything and died together with Brando, he would not dare to touch this guy at all. Thinking this through, Arek asked with a gloomy face, "How do you want me to help? Do you have any spells that can block this guy's mouth?" Brando asked, covered in blood. "There is, but it's hard to say how effective it will be," Arek replied. "You know very well that you have the strength of elemental activation. If it's difficult for you to block it, my spells won't be effective." Arek's words were not out of Brando's expectations. In fact, even Arek's thoughts at the moment could not escape his guess. It was nothing more than running away alone or staying in the same boat with him. Even in the worst case, if Arek wanted to die together with him, It was actually just the other party's wishful thinking. He still had the elapsed needle in his hand, and he could rely on this thing to save his life at any time. Under the acceleration of the passage of time by 10 times, the whole world was basically stagnant for him. It was because of this that he dared to stay and stall for time. Then use an ice wall spell to seal its mouth, Brando said immediately. Ice wall spell. Arek was stunned. That thing could be used to block the goblins, but would it work on this thing? That's right, release it quickly, Brando roared. The Duke snorted in displeasure, but his hands were not slow. He gestured with his cane, and a thin layer of ice as thin as glass appeared in front of Brendel, just in time to seal the Frost Devourer's mouth. However, no matter how Arek looked at it, he felt that this spell was not very reliable, because in just a moment obvious cracks appeared on the ice wall. But the next moment, he suddenly saw a purple mist gushing out of the giant worm's throat, but the mist was just blocked behind the ice wall. Arek was well informed and recognized what it was at once. Petrification spit? You're quite knowledgeable, Brando replied. Now your task is to constantly reinforce this ice wall. We can hold on for half an hour and then we can retreat. Arek looked at Brando suspiciously, and he was more and more convinced that this guy was the successor of the Darkness Dragon. Otherwise, the ordinary Frost Devourer would not have any spitting ability. How could he predict the ability of this mutant monster so accurately? But thinking about it, he still asked very cautiously, how do we retreat? Chapter 823. I have my ways, Brando replied. Naturally, he wouldn't reveal the secret of the elapsing needle. Now that the petrifying mist, the only threat to this big worm, had been sealed, and it couldn't compete with him in terms of strength. His frenzy talent still had a long time to go, so it wouldn't be a problem to maintain this stalemate for 15 minutes. He was now a little glad that the battlefield wasn't on the ground. Skills like the Frost Devourer's Earthquake and Roll couldn't be used under the ice. Otherwise, he wouldn't have to struggle and could just wait for death. Noticing that Arek was still a little worried, he added, Don't worry, I would have killed you long ago if I wanted to. The crimes you committed in Ampere Seal are enough for you to die 10,000 times. But since I didn't kill you just now, I won't deal with you now before I find a way to get your ring snake ring. This was an open secret between the two, and Brando simply mentioned it bluntly. Arek listened and smiled coldly, but did not answer. However, Brando knew that this guy was obviously unwilling and was looking for a way to escape. With this sentence, Arek finally settled down a lot. At least Brando didn't have to worry that this guy would suddenly have thoughts of perishing together with him. What followed was a boring stalemate. Arek thickened the ice layer over and over again, and the ice wall formed a huge ice block in the throat of the Frost Devourer. Fortunately, this thing didn't need lungs to breathe, or it would probably be the first boss to die from suffocation. But even so, Brando's existence still made it very uncomfortable. At first, this thing jumped up and down for a while, and about 10 minutes later it finally quieted down, as if it had exhausted its strength. In short, it was motionless, but Brando could still feel the temperature of this thing and knew that it was not dead yet. As for whether it was pretending to be dead or really exhausted, he didn't know, but at least this was a good sign. It meant that this thing had temporarily settled down. As long as there were a few more minutes, they could escape according to the original plan. Brando didn't know where Ko Hua and the others had dug to, but a quarter of an hour was enough for them to dig a few hundred meters. The frost-devouring giant worm didn't have much intelligence. As long as it didn't make any sound, it wouldn't be able to catch up. Brando could only be thankful that this thing didn't rely on smell but hearing to track. Otherwise, with his body covered in blood, it was estimated that this thing would catch up even if he ran 10 miles away. But just as he was about to relax a little, he suddenly felt the big guy under his control shake, and then it raised its head slightly. "What are you doing?" Brando was startled. He felt that the Frost Devourer was shrinking back. Was it trying to escape? But his instincts told him otherwise. He was wondering, but he didn't expect the Frost Devourer to suddenly rush forward after retreating slightly. This time, even Arek, who was in front, couldn't react in time and was directly knocked to the side. If he hadn't reacted quickly, he would have been crushed into a meat patty by this giant beast. Arek wasn't crushed into a meat patty, but Brando, who was stuck in its mouth, was unlucky. At this moment, Brando finally understood what this thing wanted to do. It went crazy. He didn't know if it was because of the toothpick in its mouth that made it unbearable, or because of the ice in its throat that made it uncomfortable. In short, after a short silence, the boss went completely crazy. It slammed directly into the ice wall in front of it, smashing a huge hole in the wall and moving through the underground glacier as fast as lightning. This was just an instinctive action for the Frost Devourer, but for Brando, it was simply miserable. The monster slammed into one ice wall after another with him. Even with Brando's physique, he was about to vomit blood at this moment. Brando was seeing stars, thinking that this wasn't how the script should play out. At this moment he wanted to start the elapsed needle, but there was nothing he could do. First of all, he didn't dare to move his hands at all. Otherwise this big worm would bite him, and he would be sent to see Lady Martha. But if he didn't move, even he didn't know where he would be taken. He only felt that he was shuttling through the dark underground, but he didn't know how far he had walked. Anyway, his back was already numb. Suddenly, there was nothing behind him, and only the sound of the wind was left in his ears. Brando instinctively felt that they should have passed through the range of the underground glacier. He wanted to look back, but when he did, he was almost scared out of his wits. This thing brought him straight out of a cliff, and beyond it was a bottomless abyss. This abyss was even more ridiculous than the abyss below the spiral hall. It was pitch black and seemingly endless, as if it led directly to the Sulphur River. "Stop!" Brando shouted. At this moment he finally couldn't care less. He quickly let go of the sword in his hand and reached for the elapsed needle hanging in front of his chest. At this moment, the Frost Devourer had already let out a wail. Most of its body rushed out of the cliff, like a derailed train, falling into the abyss with Brando. It was not until this time that Brando finally touched the dial. "Start!" he shouted in his heart. With a crisp click, Brando felt as if a flowing ripple was spreading in all directions with him as the center. Then at that moment the whole world slowed down in his eyes. He saw that he and the Frost Devourer were still falling, but the speed of their fall was negligible. The big worm seemed to be hanging in the air, and the big hole it drilled out of the cliff was just a few feet away. "I'm saved!" Brando shouted in his heart. He hurriedly pulled out the Haurangaya and climbed out from under the terrifying mouth of the Frost Devourer. He then climbed up the long body of the thing, trying to return to the cliff. But it was at this time that he suddenly felt that something was wrong. As if he was possessed, he turned his head back. Half an hour ago, at the other end of the dark underground world, the mountain girl blinked and woke up. She stayed in the darkness for a long time before she remembered what happened before she fainted. She quickly struggled to sit up. It was pitch black all around. The girl was usually quiet and strong in front of Brando, but now she was fumbling on the ground in a panic. It was not easy to grab a long object wrapped in cloth. She quickly removed the cloth wrapped around the object, and then used her hand to confirm what was inside in the darkness. It was a halberd. But she seemed to have found a rare treasure and breathed a long sigh of relief. She sat for a while with the halberd in her hand, as if she was not used to the current situation. But her vision slowly adapted to the darkness, and she could gradually distinguish the surrounding situation with the glimmer of light from the glacier. As far as her eyes could see, it was completely different from what Brando saw when he woke up. This was the bottom of a long underground ice crevice, and the widest part could fit 7 or 8 people side by side. From afar it looked like a canyon, but the canyon gradually extended into the darkness until it disappeared at the end of the vision. Scarlet waited for a while, but no one else appeared. She then stood up in fear and called out softly, "My lord, my lord." The echo was transmitted along the ice wall, echoing in the valley like a ghost. The mountain girl's face was pale. She pursed her lips tightly, and her mind repeatedly recalled what happened when the hall collapsed. She watched the young prince and Medisha fall in front of her and disappear into the abyss below. Then the whole hall fell apart. She seemed to have fallen with the broken bridge, and then she lost consciousness. Right now, her chest felt as if it had been pierced through. Presumably, a few of her ribs were broken. Fortunately, she was a mercenary, so this kind of injury was not enough to make her cry. Although she was lucky enough to survive, she did not know if the Lord was safe. At the thought of this, she trembled with fear. The mountain girl looked around, hoping to find Brando, but she was afraid to see a cold corpse. She searched for a while with this contradictory mentality. Suddenly, she found a pair of feet buried under the ice not far away. This discovery almost suffocated her. But when she came closer, she was relieved. It was the military boots of the crew's people. It must be the bodies of the crew's nobles who were near her at that time. She took a light breath and began to move along the ice and snow that had fallen from above. Soon, she found that the bodies of the Kurlutzian nobles were scattered everywhere in the snow. Some of them had been completely crushed by the accumulated ice, and their bodies and limbs were in a strange posture. But these things did not bring the slightest ripple to Scarlet's heart. She sat expressionlessly among the strange bodies, and her expression became more and more relieved. Finally, she confirmed that none of the bodies belonged to the people she said she was familiar with. She could not help but sigh softly. However, she immediately revealed a look of disappointment. Where was the Lord? Ever since Brando took her in, she never left Brando's side. It was only this time that she could not see his tall and broad back, and she felt lost. Scarlet touched her chest. Her heart felt empty, but even she did not understand what was going on. Just as she was walking aimlessly along the ice crevice, she suddenly heard a weak groan from the broken ice. She stopped and listened carefully, and finally determined that the sound came from under the ice. She hesitated for a moment. She was very sensitive to sounds, and it was definitely not the voice of the Lord, nor anyone she was familiar with. But after some consideration, the Highlander girl broke the ice and found a young man wearing a crew's military uniform buried under the ice. Scarlet looked at the golden thread on the man's collar and recognized that he was a viscount. She naturally did not know this knowledge, but after following Amandina and Brando around, she gradually learned some things. Such a young viscount was most likely a descendant of a large family. Moreover, those who were with Veronica most likely had some status and background in the crew's empire. The empire worshipped martial arts, and the large families liked to send their children to the army to gain experience. Even the royal family was no exception. These things were told to her by Brando as a story. Scarlet's eyes warmed when she thought of Brando. The young man's face was purple from the cold. If it was an ordinary person, he would have died long ago. But this group of noble officers who came with Veronica were at least gold-ranked, so he recovered quickly. A trace of color gradually returned to his purple face. The young man sat for a while longer before he recovered. He opened his eyes, and they were as blue as the shallow sea. He was a typical crew's citizen. His bloodline was the same as Vahina's, and was envied in the empire. But it was meaningless to Scarlet. She looked at the young man and pondered for a moment. Can you walk on your own? Scarlet suddenly remembered that it had been a long time since she took the initiative to speak such a long sentence. Even her voice was a little dry. She wasn't like this when she was in the Grey Wolves mercenaries, but the incident with Makarov was a huge blow to her. The young man nodded and replied with some gratitude. Thank you for saving my life. He wobbled as he struggled to get up from the ground. He had thought that the beautiful lady would come up to help him, but he didn't expect the mountain girl to be like a puppet, looking at him without any trace of politeness. He could not help but feel a little awkward, but he still introduced himself. My name is Babarn and I. But before he could finish, he was interrupted by Scarlet. He finally realized that she did not want to talk to him. He quickly stopped her. Please wait. Scarlet stopped and looked back at him, but her eyes were full of caution. It was as if she was saying, What's the matter? If not, I'm leaving. Babarn smiled bitterly and shook his head. I'm sure I'm not the only survivor under the ice. Miss, can you do me a favor and save them? Or at least help me move the corpses of my comrades out. I can't just leave them exposed in the wilderness. Scarlet shook her head. Babarn gulped. He felt that it was a little too difficult to deal with this lady. But for some reason he felt that this Highlander girl was more real. He was the son of a big family. He had seen the so-called upper-class socialites, but in reality they were just SOSO. But when he faced Scarlet, he felt his heart skip a few beats. He scratched his head and thought to himself, I'm not a young boy anymore. What's wrong with me today? But this hesitation only lasted for a moment. Babarn paused for a moment and immediately replied, Miss, you are also looking for companions, right? With all due respect, I mean if they are also sealed under the ice like this one, they need your help right now. Scarlet heard Babarn say this and was slightly startled. She showed a hesitant look but finally nodded. She was not afraid of Brando being sealed under the ice. Such a thin layer of ice could not seal the Lord at all. But she was worried about the little prince. Brando entrusted Haruz to her and Medisha to take care of. Now that the little prince was missing, it was her responsibility. So the two began to search and rescue along the ice crevice. In less than 20 minutes, they rescued 7 or 8 people one after another. But there were more corpses. The corpses of the cruise people were lined up in a long line at the bottom of the valley. At first, Babarn was still in the mood to curry favor with Scarlet, but later, his expression gradually changed. Most of these people were nobles and most of them died here. And this time the blame could not be pushed to Veronica's head, because they were the Empire's military observation group. To put it bluntly, they were here to supervise Veronica. If the Folded Sword Squad was mostly lost here, they would most likely gloat. But until Babarn dug up the last Kurletzian's body from under the ice, he looked at the surviving person in charge with a pale face. The guy's face was already ashen. In this pile of corpses the others were fine, but 2 of them were the heirs of House Cecil. This was a big problem. Originally, everyone knew that House Cecil and House Ashrick were sworn enemies in the Empire. These 2 had originally grasped Veronica's weakness in the loop of trade winds and came to catch the head of the female corps. They thought that this would be a pleasant trip. Thinking about it, the Empire's military observation team never went to the front line, and under normal circumstances they would not encounter any danger. But this time, Veronica was determined to enter the holy cathedral of the Hibernator. Of course they could have stayed outside, but these 2 guys were also obsessed. They had to encourage others to follow in, wanting to see what tricks Veronica had up her sleeves. Of course, they suspected that Veronica had colluded with Tanajil. This was a tacit secret in the observation team. People like Babarn did not want to participate in the struggle between House Cecil and House Ashrick, but they also did not want to offend the heirs of the 2 great families. With the tacit consent of the person in charge, everyone followed in. The most important thing was that Prince Lenoret did not object, which was equivalent to a tacit consent. But the problem now was that they did not know if Veronica had any conspiracy, but 2 of the heirs of House Cecil died in an accident. If only one died it would be fine, but now it was impossible to explain. Thinking this clearly, everyone, including Babarn, could not help but feel a little dejected. They sat next to a large pile of corpses, unable to find any way out. If nothing unexpected happened, they would definitely suffer the retaliation of the Cecil family. These large families wouldn't be reasonable. Babine's family was enough to keep him out of this whirlpool, but the rest of them weren't so lucky. But there was an exception among these people. That was Scarlet. The mountain girl did not understand the intrigue between these nobles. She could not say whether she was lucky or unlucky. She did not know any of the people who were rescued or dug out. The young prince, Medisha, and Miss Alaz all seemed to have disappeared. This made her feel both disappointed and fortunate. Disappointed that she did not know what to do, and fortunate that at least she did not see their cold bodies. As for those sighing Kurletzian nobles, it had nothing to do with her. She didn't even look at those people and walked away with her azure lance. She knew that Brendel didn't like Kurletzians, and she instinctively kept a respectful distance from these arrogant Kurletzian nobles. Anyway, the Lord must have his reasons. The mountain girl's thoughts were simple. But she did not know that as soon as she walked away, she attracted the attention of the cruise people. "Who is that little girl?" Someone among the sighing nobles suddenly asked. P.S. Day 5, continue to ask for votes. Chapter 824. Who is that little girl? Such a question suddenly popped out from the crowd, causing everyone to be startled for a moment. The lively discussion also stopped as everyone turned to look at Baba An. "She seems to be the Countess's maid," Babarn replied absent-mindedly. His mind was filled with thoughts of how to ask Count Trentheim for her. He didn't know if he would agree, but he probably would. The Count wouldn't mind having another friend, especially if this friendship came from within the Empire. Babarn was full of confidence. The nobles were a little disappointed. She was just the Countess's maid. It was not important. Usually they would have teased her, but now they were not in the mood to do so. The topic quickly turned back to the possible retaliation from the Cecil family. They started to sigh again, but people were not willing to sit still and wait for death. Very quickly someone said, "This matter is not our responsibility. If it wasn't for that country bumpkin count bringing us to this damned place, this matter wouldn't have happened." This statement was immediately echoed. They had completely forgotten that they did not have to follow in. Veronica could not restrain them, and Brando was more than happy to bring them along. But the person who suggested this was now a cold corpse lying on the ground, and they did not dare to put the blame on the heir of the Cecil family, so they simply chose to ignore this point. But everyone knew that this kind of complaint was meaningless. The Cecil family might vent their anger on the Count Tanagal, but this did not mean that they would not cause trouble for them. This kind of behemoth did not care about the feelings of small shrimps. But in the midst of all the sighs, a voice asked tentatively, "What if Teal and John are right?" This suggestion was like a devil's temptation, and the valley under the glacier suddenly quieted down. Everyone was frozen in place and only their eyes were rolling. No one dared to speak. Their faces were a mixture of fear, realization, disbelief, and a little hope. Teal and John were the two heirs of the Cecil family who had become stiff and cold. Of course they were one of them. As for what they said was right, everyone present knew. After a long while someone said dryly, This may be a way, but if it fails we will have to face the wrath of both sides." What's the difference between one side and two sides? Can a person die twice? With someone taking the lead, the others were emboldened. But where is the evidence? Someone asked cautiously. Evidence? What evidence do we need? We are the officers' observation group. We are the evidence. The person who spoke looked at everyone and said gloomily, "You saw it with your own eyes. That Ash Blademaster, he is our enemy. But he saved her life. Why? His duchy is still in the Empire's territory. Would he be willing to let it go? There must be a conspiracy." In fact, everyone present thought that Mephisto was just being a gentleman. The Ash Blademaster hated the Empire. But he did not need to play tricks in this place. With his character, he would only defeat his enemies fair and square. But this time no one refuted. Someone asked carefully, "You mean Veronica and him are plotting to restore the duchy? But what good does it do her? It doesn't make sense. Her Majesty is not a fool." Someone shook his head. "You've all forgotten one thing," the man encouraged. "Mephistopheles is that country bumpkin count's teacher, and Veronica is very close to that count. They must have some secret deal. But how can we know the inside story of the deal? Her Majesty will not only listen to our words. She is the real commander of the Legion. Without concrete evidence, the Empire can't do anything to her. It is because she is the commander that Her Majesty is more suspicious. As for the inside story of the deal, we do not have it now, but we will soon." The man looked at the direction where Scarlet disappeared and smiled coldly, revealing his white teeth. A prismatic platform lay in the darkness, like a lone island on a pitch-black lake. Countless pipes extended from all directions, connecting to the base of the platform. Brando was fixed there as if he was under a spell. He clearly remembered that when the Frost Devourer rushed out of the cliff, he looked back and saw a bottomless abyss behind him. But at this moment, this strange platform seemed to appear out of thin air, less than 300 feet below him and the Frost Devourer King. But what was this place? There was absolutely no player in the game who found such a place. Moreover, how did this damn platform appear? Was it because he was too nervous before and saw wrongly? No, it was impossible. Brando suddenly thought of something. He climbed up the back of the giant worm with his hands and feet. After running for about 10 meters, he suddenly felt as if he had passed through a thin layer of water curtain. This is it. He looked back, and there was still the unfathomable abyss behind him. He took a breath and slowly returned to the back of the water curtain. At the moment when he passed through the water curtain, the scenery in front of him seemed to ripple. When his vision became clear again, the platform appeared in front of him again. There was no doubt that this was an illusion. There was a huge illusion hidden under the cliff. An uncontrollable shudder swept through Brando's body. He knew even with his knees that the scene hidden under this illusion was definitely not an ordinary place. This must be the eternal rest of gods mentioned by Ko Hua, which was the real location of the hidden boss in the game, Surash. But he immediately calmed down. The question now was whether to go back the way he came or go down to have a look. Logically speaking, the little female dragon should have gotten the star-shaped stone, and Arek's scheme should have been completely thwarted. Now was not the time to complicate things. It was best to get out of this place as soon as possible, find Freya, Scarlet, the Shire and the others and meet up with Erwin outside. Not only would he eliminate the potential threat of Erwin, but he would also gain a favor from Cruz's people. It was already a great deal. But Brando glanced at the abyss below. There was also another voice in his heart, like a demon tempting him to go down and have a look. Martha above, this was such a rare opportunity. The secret that countless players had spent countless hours to find was now right in front of him. He only needed to take a few steps back, and the legendary boss would appear in front of him. Brando took a deep breath and glanced at the platform one last time. But this was no longer a game and he only had one chance here. Once he made the wrong choice, it would be too late for regrets. What's more, he was no longer alone at this moment. In this temple there were the Shire, Medisha and Freya waiting for him. And outside the temple, his fate had already been linked to everyone in Abyss. He only understood one thing, and that was that he could not disappoint those who relied on him. Although Brando's heart was extremely agitated, he finally calmed down. He secretly sighed and turned back to climb up the Frost Devourer's back. But it was at this moment, a slightly contemptuous voice sounded in his heart. What a coward! Brando was slightly stunned. This was definitely not the voice of Saint Tassel. He subconsciously turned back to look for the source of the voice, but he saw an unexpected scene. At that moment, it was as if a circle of strange ripples was rippling in the darkness in front of him. It was like an isolated water wave starting from a point, expanding in all directions and quickly passing by him. In the space where time was almost still, Brando suddenly looked up. At that moment he smelled the power that once appeared on Ko Hua. But it was more majestic and invincible. It was above the law, the power of existence, the power of God. Wherever the ripples passed, the lines of law disintegrated. Brando almost watched as the needle on the dial hanging on his chest began to slow down automatically, and the time around seemed to start flowing again. The elapsed needle automatically failed. The wailing of the Frost Devourer still echoed above the abyss, and he was still falling. Brando was shocked. He already understood that he might have been targeted by the awakening god. Only the power of existence could easily suppress the power of the lesser divine artifact. Almost without time to think, with a loud bang, the Frost Devourer King had taken him down from a height of hundreds of feet and landed heavily on the solid ground of the square. The impact of the demonic creature's weight of hundreds of tons directly tore open its back. The sound was like tearing apart cloth, and then blood gushed out, revealing the bloody body below. Then it bounced up high and fell heavily again, making a sound similar to a deflated rubber ball hitting the ground. Just like that, it collapsed on the ground like a lump of rotten meat, motionless. Like a water pipe bursting, countless blood gushed out from large and small cracks, converging into a bloodstream around it. This once insufferably arrogant demonic creature had come to the end of its life at this moment. Brando was not much better off. Just at the moment when the Frost Devourer King landed, he wanted to use his elemental power to make himself fly up, but unfortunately, the lines of law had already been scattered after the baptism of the power of existence and could not be activated at all. As a result, he and the Frost Devourer King fell heavily to the ground together, and the impact immediately sent him flying. Fortunately, he did not have the terrifying weight of the Frost Devourer King, and he had the ladder as a buffer, so he was only thrown heavily to the ground. Brando adjusted his posture at the last moment of landing and rolled a few times. Although he was dizzy from the impact, it was nothing more than that. At most, he had some scratches on his body. Of course, this was also because of his own strength. If it were an ordinary person, he would have been smashed into a meat patty, but for the existence of elemental activation, hundreds of feet in the air was nothing. If he had been prepared in advance, he could have jumped down directly without the need for a buffer, and he would not have been injured. But this time it was unexpected after all. When Brando staggered up from the ground, he felt dizzy and uncomfortable as if his brain had been hit by a hammer. He tried several times before he could stand up again. He only felt that his mind was in a mess. The only thing he remembered was that the person who pulled him back to this square must be an enemy, not a friend, so he immediately raised the Halrangaya and put on a defensive posture. "Who is it?" he shouted. "It's me," a woman's voice said in the square. "Ko Hua." Brando immediately recognized the voice. "You call my sister Ko Hua and you call me Ko Hua. You don't seem to be sincere at all," the woman's voice replied. Brando was slightly stunned, and immediately realized that the woman was probably the dark side of Ko Hua who had escaped before. Since she appeared here, this was most likely the land of eternal rest of gods. He calmed down and looked around, but other than this bare square, he did not see where the so-called awakening god was. He narrowed his eyes slightly and answered the woman's words. "Then what should I call you, respected lady?" Brando was still a little dizzy, so he talked aimlessly to buy some time so that he could recover to his best condition as soon as possible. The elapsed time needle had ended, and he quietly checked his status. The system had automatically deducted some of his experience, but fortunately, it seemed that he was the one who killed the Frost Devourer. The boss's experience was a generous reward, and it made his experience much more than before. The woman's voice snorted softly, as if she was sneering. Of course, she saw through Brando's intentions, but she was too lazy to care. She only asked jokingly, "Weren't you very brave before? Why are you suddenly so timid, Mr. Human?" This human's tone was exactly the same as Ko Hua's, as expected of two different existences. However, Brando was a little puzzled. Why did he feel that Ekis' eldest daughter was targeting him? He looked up in confusion and asked, "I don't know what you mean." "You're the one who called out my name in the spiral hall, and almost ruined all my previous efforts, aren't you?" Ko Hua's voice was cold. Brando's mind buzzed and he thought to himself, "Oh no, I didn't expect her to see it." Ko Hua's dark side was famous for being vengeful. No wonder she would stop him. It seemed that she was ready to settle the score. His back was covered in cold sweat, but he was too lazy to say more. The other party was the hidden boss here, and now that he was in this square, it was inevitable that he would have to fight. He simply held Halrangaya tightly and waited for the other party to make a move. But it was at this time that a dark flame suddenly appeared above the square with a whoosh. Brando looked up and saw the flame split in the middle. A girl with a similar figure to Ko Hua slowly walked out from it, but her whole body, including her clothes, was made of burning black flames. She floated in the air and looked at him condescendingly. "I'm curious, how did you recognize my human form? Don't use your clumsy excuses to brush me off. Even the Bugas have never seen what I look like." Brando was about to speak, but the girl seemed to have seen through his thoughts and blocked his way out first. But then she muttered to herself a little strangely, "How strange, I can't see through your origin. Who are you?" Brando was shocked. "You can see my thoughts? I'm a god after all." The girl's voice echoed in the darkness. "You're a god?" Brando reacted. "No, this is not your power, this is Milo's." "Clever." The girl smiled, but Brando could not feel the naivety and innocence of Ko Hua at all. He only felt that the other party's smile was eerie. "Didn't you ask how you should call me? I'm Surash, the only god enwombed after the year of the fallen stars. But I'm no longer the awakening god." "I'm the awakening god." Dream on, Brando thought. If you're a real god, how are the players going to play? After all, this is a level 5 or 60 dungeon. Although it's a hidden boss, as long as it's a boss, there's a chance of defeating it. Brando suddenly thought that this self-proclaimed Surash, Ko Hua's sister, who seemed a little muddle-headed, seemed to have the same idea as him. She was also stalling for time. It's conceivable that Milos's true form has not fully awakened yet. This is not a very short process. Brando suddenly thought of the huge wreckage they saw on the glacier. What the true form of the giant god was like was already obvious. "Brando!" Just as Brando was full of complaints, Saint Tossel's voice suddenly sounded in his mind. "Someone is approaching from above." "How do you know, great sage?" Brando was slightly startled. Since when did this elf have the function of radar? He had never heard of it before. "Stupid, I feel Angelique and the others. Yeruda and Peya." Brando looked up at the endless cliffs above. "The two siblings can't fly." "The two siblings can't, but someone else can. It should be someone carrying them. It's very fast and it's probably your teacher." "Mephisto?" Brando's heart skipped a beat. If there were two people, Then the remaining one was probably Veronica. Although he didn't know how they found this direction, if these two could join the battle, he would be more confident in dealing with this fake god Surash. Thinking of this, he didn't intend to immediately expose the other party's lie. Instead, he continued. In that case, Lord Surash, what's your purpose in bringing me here? Although I almost ruined your plan by accident as a god, it seems that you don't have to be calculative with a mortal like me, do you? Naturally, I won't be calculative with you. The girl's voice laughed coldly. On the contrary, as my first guest, I'll show you a good show. A good show. I'll show you how a god comes back to life, and from this moment on the history of Wonde will be changed forever. You should be honored to be able to participate, mortal. Brando didn't feel honored at all. On the contrary, he picked out the other party's faulty wording and said, Aren't you an awakened god, Miss Ko-hwa? Isn't that a bit contradictory? Uft. Brando heard Saint Tossel's laughter in his spiritual world. Ko-hwa was also a little angry. She blushed and gritted her teeth. Shut up, just watch. Brando shrugged. Anyway, he had already confirmed his previous guess, and that was enough. As long as Ko-hwa wasn't a true god, then there would be a way to defeat her. Saint Tossel laughed and said to him, You're too ungentlemanly, Brando. How can you correct a girl's slip of the tongue like that? The two whispered to each other, but they were also paying attention to the girl's every move. As soon as she finished speaking, an extremely strange buzzing sound came from the darkness. Brando looked in that direction and suddenly saw that the dense pipes in the darkness lit up one by one, as if something was flowing inside and gradually approaching the platform. The next moment the whole platform shook. No, Brando frowned. It wasn't the platform that was shaking, and it wasn't even coming from the abyss below. It was the whole cliff and the whole valley that was shaking. His expression gradually changed. This was the resonance of the mountains. He could almost feel that the trembling came from the glacier in the center of the dead frost forest. At this moment the glacier was awakened, and it was making its own sound. After thousands of years, that sound appeared on the ground again, and something was beginning to change. Chapter 825. Underground in the abyss, after the ice layer fell off, the dark artificial buildings around gradually became clear. On the smooth obsidian wall, a platinum light was extending along the notches, and soon the entire corridor was lit up. Alaz and Medisha walked curiously along the corridor, but the two had been lost for a long time. We seem to have been walking in circles, Sister Alaz. The little female dragon's face turned red, but she held the star-shaped stone in one hand and waved her claws, showing her little fangs, and said, How is that possible? You must have remembered wrongly. Medisha smiled. Yes, she nodded and smiled. Just like in the Wild of the Four Realms, the reason why we haven't reached our destination is because we are walking too slowly. Alaz seemed to have been electrocuted. She turned around and stared at Medisha with wide eyes. You, how did you know? I also know that you were the youngest dragon on the battlefield of the War of the Holy Saints, Sister Alaz. In Moros, you snuck out on a date with Lord Flora, and were caught by the Wind Elf guards, and Lord Eloranta gave you a good scolding, Medisha whispered. Do you remember what she said at the time? How can you get lost on a tryst? How can my subordinates be so much worse than Gretel and Saint Tossel? How embarrassing, get lost. The little fairy princess imitated the scene vividly. Alaz opened her mouth slightly like a puppy showing her sharp fangs. Her face was like a ripe apple. Impossible, how could anyone know about this? You, who are you? Medisha tilted her head, smiled and did not answer. Ah! Alaz suddenly screamed. She looked at her with some surprise. I remember, it's you, little Princess Crescent. Why did you change your name to such a strange one? That's my surname, Sister Alaz. Medisha sighed. My real name is Medisha. The little female dragon stuck out her tongue and replied with some annoyance. You look different. Medisha touched her forehead. Sister Alaz, I am a heroic spirit. My appearance will not change. Is that so? Alaz scratched her round cheeks. Then I probably remembered wrongly. So let me lead the way, Medisha replied. Just like when we worked together before. Okay. But Alaz did not answer. Instead, she raised a finger and pressed it against Medusa's lips. Shoo! She said. Do you hear something? Medusa was shocked and quickly took a small step back, glaring at her. It's true, there's a sound. The little female dragon quickly replied. Really? The silver elf princess raised her eyebrows slightly. She knew that the 5 senses of the golden race were much more sensitive than other races, but suddenly her pointed ears twitched. Both of them turned their heads in a certain direction at the same time. Over there was a crossroad in the long corridor, and a battered figure was limping slowly from there. After a while, Alaz and Medisha emerged from the invisibility spell. That guy looks familiar. The little female dragon bared her teeth. Suspicious. It's Dukarak. Medisha replied. She and Alaz looked at each other. The white beam of light pierced through heaven and earth. Maynard and the others turned their heads and stared in that direction from afar. The second time, Veronica looked angrily at Ko Hua as another image in front of her was drowned in the white light. Levas, the border city of Cruz, had been reduced to ashes. She was so angry that she almost crushed the hilt of her sword, but Brando held on tightly to the female army commander, afraid that she would lose her mind. The 3 of them had launched many attacks on Ko Hua, but they had all failed. The divine barrier was like a wall of despair, lying between the mortals and the gods. There was no way to break through. Ko Hua turned her gaze to the next image, Uskin, a city of wind elves. Brando looked nervously at the rapidly changing images. There were still 2 more images, and below them was the beautiful castle by Lake Kirkle. He was so nervous that his palms were sweating. How could there be such a battle? I have to think of a way. At this time, Ko Hua suddenly looked up, as if looking at something. Her voice echoed on the platform again. Sister, you're here. Brando was slightly startled. He turned around and saw the figures of the young prince and Prince Lenoret appear on the cliff. Teacher. Lady Veronica. His and Shido's voices were the first to be heard, and then Brando saw another Ko Hua appear behind them. In the middle of the hall, Ko Hua's dark side frowned, while the kind Ko Hua just nodded gently. Could the key to the battle be the kind Ko Hua? This thought flashed through Brando's mind. She is? Mephistopheles asked. That is also Ko Hua. And the one controlling Milos is her dark soul. 2 sides of one. Brando nodded. Something like that. Ah, wait. He was surprised to see that Veronica had already charged in that direction. Obviously, this female army commander had thought of the same thing, but the problem was that Veronica was much more decisive than he was. But by the time he reacted, the tip of Veronica's sword was almost in front of Ko Hua. The kind Ko Hua was almost stunned. Her eyes widened, and she just stood there in a daze, not understanding why this human woman attacked her indiscriminately as soon as she saw her. Of course, even if she was not stunned, she might not be able to dodge Veronica's sword. After all, one was a spellcaster and the other was a warrior. In close combat, there was no comparison at all. Ko Hua opened her mouth slightly, and just as Veronica's sword was about to pierce through her heart, Brando's anxious shout finally came. Haruz, stop her! Without hesitation, the young prince unsheathed his sword to block Veronica's attack. However, Veronica did not even spare him a glance. The gap between the 2 of them was simply not on the same level. Just as the young prince unsheathed his sword, he felt a gentle force on his hand. Before he could react, his sword flew out of his hand and stabbed into the ceiling of the cave. But it was only a slight delay, and the kind Korfa finally reacted. She let out a low cry, and fell on her butt on the ground in fright. Veronica's cyan sword aura flew over Ko Hua's head, only cutting off a few strands of hair. She frowned and prepared to attack again, but at this moment, Ko Hua's dark attack finally arrived. How dare you? The dark Ko Hua's voice rumbled, and a white electric whip lashed out at Veronica. Veronica did not dare to block it directly, so she could only lean to the side and let the electric whip hit the cliff, cutting off a table-sized fragment from the solid wall. And with this delay, Veronica finally lost the chance to continue attacking the kind Ko Hua. She could not help but turn around and glare at Brando. But Brando only felt relieved. In fact, he had already thought it through. The key to this battle was definitely not Ko Hua. Ko Hua came to this platform because of him and the young prince. The key to this battle was definitely not a factor that could only appear on the battlefield. In other words, if Ko Hua did not appear, there would be no way to fight this battle. This was obviously illogical. He hurriedly gestured to Veronica, indicating that he had something to explain. But at this moment, Brando saw the fragment that Ko Hua's electric whip had swept down behind Veronica tumbling down. It hit one of the energy transmission pipes, and with a crack the pipe caved in. The pipe immediately flashed, and the light on it was quickly extinguished. Seeing this, Brando's heart skipped a beat. "I know, so it's here." He immediately looked up and shouted to Mephisto and Veronica, "Attack the platform! Attack those pipes!" The Ash Sword Saint and Veronica were slightly stunned and looked at him with some confusion. Clearly, they did not understand for a moment. Brando was so anxious that he could not help but shout, Ko Hua is just a false god. She has no divine power barrier at all. The absolute difference in her body comes from Milo's. Her power comes from this platform. Right now, she has not completely merged with Milo's body. It will be fine as long as she is cut off from the platform." As soon as Brando's voice fell, Dark Ko Hua, who was above the platform, changed her expression. "Don't joke around, you guessed wrong." She hurriedly defended herself. Veronica and Mephisto looked at each other and immediately flew to the left and right sides of the energy transmission network scattered to the left and right sides of the platform. With a few flashes of sword light, dozens of energy transmission pipes were cut in the middle. The disordered magic flow formed a pulse like a nova explosion. In the blink of an eye, several huge holes were blasted in the dense network. "Damn it!" Ko Hua screamed. She could no longer maintain her calm. She raised her hands and countless lightning bolts appeared out of thin air on the platform, like raindrops striking toward Brando, Mephisto, and Veronica. Mephisto and Veronica were fine. They could deal with these lightning attacks with a little distraction, but Brando was in a bit of trouble. It seemed that the other party was retaliating against him for finding out that weakness. Almost half of the lightning bolts were aimed at him. He only blocked 2 or 3 before the fourth hit him directly. His body went numb and he was immediately bathed in the lightning storm. If it were not for his ridiculously high will, he would probably have been sent to see Martha directly. But even so, the dense lightning bolt still took away almost 2/3 of his HP. More importantly, his clothes were now like that of a beggar's. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. He knew that this AoE attack should be shared by everyone in the party, but now there were only 3 of them in the party, and Ko Hua saw him as the number 1 target. He could only blame himself for being unlucky. After the lightning storm, Veronica and Mephisto launched another attack. But this time Ko Hua was smarter. She simply gave up on attacking altogether. Instead, she channeled all her energy into the ground and supported a strong protective shield over the pipes. In the beginning, Brando could cut through several pipes with a single slash. But after Ko Hua cast the shield, she might not be able to cut through even one pipe. He looked back and saw that the progress of Veronica and Mephisto had been greatly reduced. However, Brando felt that Ko Hua's brain was probably a little off. Although she did greatly slow them down, the problem was that if she did not attack, the pipes would be cut through one by one. Of course, Brando was happy to see the boss being stupid. No one would complain that their boss battle was too easy. Besides, he vaguely felt that the problem was not that simple. "Please wait a moment." Scarlet heard the voice behind her and turned back. She glanced at the young man who had caught up from behind. She remembered that he seemed to have introduced himself as Babarn or something else. The name sounded a little strange to her. Erwin rarely had such a name, so she had a deeper impression of it. The young man ran, panting. He probably had something urgent to attend to. The Highlander girl stared at him blankly. After a while, she remembered that she should be the one asking the question. "What is it?" "Beautiful lady, I still don't know your name." Scarlet frowned. "What does my name have to do with you?" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. I just wanted to thank you." The young man replied breathlessly. He faintly felt the hostility of the other party. He was a little surprised but immediately added, "Thank me? Yes, thank you for saving us. I can't not repay you for saving my life." Scarlet thought for a moment. Babarn seemed a little nervous. He did not know why, but he always felt that he could not move freely in front of the other party. At first, he thought that it was because the other party was too much to his liking. But after spending some time together, he began to gradually feel that there seemed to be a strange temperament in the other party, faintly exuding a frightening aura. Of course, He did not know that the blood of the dragon and the thunder god flowed in Scarlet's body at the same time. He vaguely felt that the Countess's handmaiden was a little unusual. He suddenly felt a little nervous and began to regret that he should not have agreed to work with those guys. At this time, Scarlet finally recovered from her daze. She looked up at the surrounding cliffs and asked as if she was referring to something. "You said that you want to thank me. Is this how you thank me?" The young man was slightly stunned. But Scarlet had already picked up the halberd in her hand and pointed in all directions of the underground glacier. "These rats hiding in the corner. Are they your companions?" Babarn's face changed. At the same time, the faces of the noble soldiers who were pointed out by the mountain girl did not look good. They awkwardly walked out from the shadows around them and looked at the girl with some surprise. Only the leader from before clapped and praised dryly. "This is really beyond our expectations. I didn't expect the young lady to be a real master." Scarlet looked at these people quietly and frowned, but she was secretly prepared to be on guard. After all, she was a mercenary. Just by looking at the position of these people, she knew that they did not come with good intentions. "Don't worry," the man continued. "We do want to thank the young lady. We hope that the young lady will come with us to cruise as a guest. The Empire has always been hospitable. We will definitely treat you well." Babarn quickly nodded. "Yes, we won't embarrass you. We just want to ask you for a favor." "A favor?" "Yes, beautiful lady. If you agree, I will personally ask His Majesty to restore your freedom. You will become a free citizen of Cruz. You will not have to bow down to anyone. Besides, with your ability, it is not impossible for you to become a noble of the Empire." Babarn explained. But never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that he had said something wrong. In fact, just as he finished saying that he would let her regain her freedom, he saw that the eyes of the seemingly innocent mountain girl had already revealed a ferocious glint like that of a wild beast. Chapter 826. Kurobo, the outskirts of Whitetown. Kurobo Church wasn't the most majestic church in the entire White City area. After the Year of the Wilderness, the Year of the Jade Forest, and the Year of the Croaking Frogs, the three cathedrals of Kurovi, Osrian, and Babalissa were completed, it became even more obscure. But in terms of history, this church that sat on a mound and weathered by wind and rain was one of the oldest pilgrimages in the 10 cities area. Its priest, Father Salian, was one of Bishop Byland's proudest disciples. However, this branch of the Mensa sect didn't pursue fame and fortune, so it was gradually forgotten. The outskirts of Whitetown were stormy. In the church, on the podium behind the altar, a dark-skinned priest who looked like an old farmer stared blankly at the holy water cup in front of him. The holy water chalice was a gift from Farnazane. The silver holy water chalice was filled with holy water that was filled with magic. It was said that the filthy could see their sins in the reflection of the water, the greedy could see their own ugly desires, the devout could see their firm hope, but only the pure could see the oracle from above the clouds. Although it was just a legend, the holy water cup was indeed the most sacred vessel in a pilgrimage place. It was also one of the fixed ritual props used in the most solemn ceremonies. The farmers and the poor would occasionally ask for some holy water from the church. It was said that it had healing properties, and Father Salian was willing to give it to them. But at this moment, the thunder rumbled, and the surface of the holy water cup rippled. A layer of black fog seemed to float on the surface of the water. One after another, golden words appeared in the black fog and gradually disappeared. This strange scene had lasted for a full quarter of an hour. Father Salian's forehead was full of cold sweat. He kept drawing sacred symbols on his chest and reciting hymns. However, the thunderstorm outside the window seemed to be even more violent. From time to time, the shouts of monks and apprentices could be heard from outside the church. Not long after, an ascetic drenched in water rushed in from the side door with a scripture wrapped in oiled leather. "Father, the scripture has been hidden in the cellar. This rain is strange. The demonic wave this time seems to be much bigger than the previous ones." He suddenly stopped talking when he saw Father Salian turn around with a pale face. "Father? Quick, go inform Bishop Gonzalez. Tell him to inform the Bugas." "Inform the Bugas? What happened, Sir Priest?" The cultivator's expression changed greatly. "Get the Bugas to shut down the monitoring station in the elemental frontier." Salian's hand trembled as if he was crazy, and his voice sounded like it came from the depths of hell. The constellation of Milos has been restored. A god has been resurrected in Wound. A thunderclap fell. The buzzing sound echoed in the church for a long time. The ascetic stood dumbfounded in the middle of the aisle between the 3 rows of chairs, forgetting what he was supposed to do for a moment. Go quickly. I need to see the great sage. Salian shivered and looked out of the window. The wind and rain continued to weave. Shallow water town, after the 8th month, the eastern part of Lantern Island finally showed signs of greenery. The forest was no longer lifeless with withered branches and withered leaves. Rustling sounds could be heard when the wind from Lake Kirkle swept through the forest. 2 young men were fishing on the pier by the lake, with a sand bucket by their feet. One of them was yelling as if he did not care that he had scared away his prey. Hey Lando, I'm sure I'll catch a pike today. Let's go make fun of John and the others. Shut up, you're scaring the fish away. His companion reprimanded him impatiently. Don't worry, now's not the time to take the bait. I'll be quiet later. But the wind today is a little too strong. It won't be easy to reel in the rod. The first young man held his head with both hands and leaned against the wooden pillar of the pier, muttering as he chewed on a blade of grass. Can you just shut up? Before the second young man could finish his sentence, the entire pier shook as if there was an earthquake. He bit his tongue and could not help but scream. The first young man jumped up and looked around in shock. Finally, his gaze fell on the surface of the lake. In his field of vision, a conspicuous ripple was spreading along the shore towards the center of the lake. That was definitely not a reverse wave. Hey, what's going on? Did the ground move just now? Damn it. Ugh, my tongue. It hurts. The young man called Lando was hunched over on the pier. He was in so much pain that he looked like a cooked shrimp. The first young man stood up cautiously. He felt that something was wrong. He looked up. It was the forest. The forest had quieted down. Then a buzzing sound came from the north. It sounded like the bees in old John's house, but he knew that it was not bees. There could not be so many of them. He looked up instinctively and saw a dark cloud coming from the direction of the Deathfrost forest. Something big happened. The young man immediately remembered the group of nobles who entered the forest half a month ago. Without a second thought, he grabbed his companion from the bridge and ran towards the lakeside. It was at that moment that the second shockwave arrived. From afar, the ground in the forest seemed to be rippling, and the soil that was pushed up by the shockwave swept across the entire northern shore of Lake Kirkle like a wave. The young man had just dragged his companion to the lakeside when he saw the shockwave. He could not help but cry out as he leaped from the bridge and landed firmly on the beach not far away. Behind him, the shockwave was like a whip whipping the bridge. The bridge that had stood by the lake for 15 years in shallow water town trembled, as if it was suffering from typhoid fever. In just a moment, it completely fell apart with a crash, turning into a pile of broken wood floating on the surface of the water. The young man looked at the scene with his mouth agape. There was only one thought in his mind. What's going on? The White Gorge had disappeared. The glacial valleys were melting, and the accumulated snow was collapsing and collapsing. The mountain ranges were fragmented and shattered, and the mountain peaks sank into the ground, leaving behind terrifying cracks. The earth rumbled, and the trembling mountains sang a hymn. The ice layer collapsed layer by layer amidst the song, and a glacier half the size of a town tumbled into a bottomless abyss. It dismembered in the process, making thunderous sounds. The young knights of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment stared at the scene in front of them with their mouths agape. The entire canyon had been flattened, and the glaciers on both sides were disappearing like sand in an hourglass. From time to time, someone would lose his footing in the falling snow. The people on both sides hurriedly grabbed him and dragged him up. Aaliyah was shaking off the snow in his hood. He looked up at the doomsday-like scene, and could not help but feel a little lost. Marcia above, what's going on, Brund? When did you blaspheme the gods? And now you're being punished by the heavens. Shut your stinking mouth. Brund coughed angrily on the stretcher. Maynold walked at the front of the team. She climbed up a cliff, then reached back and let little Pero grab her hand and climb up. Thank you. The latter shook the snow off his bearskin coat and thanked her. We can't go any further. What's wrong? Look ahead. Someone in the team suddenly shouted. Little Pero narrowed his eyes and looked ahead with his hand on his eyebrows. Straight ahead, the white gorge had completely disappeared and was replaced by a deep valley. Below the deep valley, the pervasive ice fog was gradually dissipating, revealing an endless black complex of buildings behind. Right below their feet, it looked like stacked obsidian cubes, but each of them was more than tens of thousands of feet long. The mist shrouded these majestic cubes, and at a glance, it looked like the legendary Titan's Ark. At this moment, the glacier was disappearing downward, and these black buildings were slowly rising in the rumbling roar. Martha above, what the hell is this? Aaliyah's eyes widened as he looked at the slowly rising black wall. Maynard watched quietly, and those strange yet familiar memories seemed to emerge automatically in her mind. Little Pero turned his head to look at her. Madame Maynard? Retreat. The retreat has long been cut off. Little Pero pointed to the high black wall and asked loudly, Madame Maynard, do you know something? Maynard turned back and stared at the short night of cruise with her dark eyes. She did not say a word, but it made the other party flinch. Little Pero understood the danger and warning in her eyes, and he took a step back subconsciously. This move immediately made him blush. He was about to speak, but was interrupted by Maynard. You want to know what that is? Without giving Little Pero a chance to speak, Maynard opened her mouth and mouthed 3 words. Milos. All the energy pipes had lit up, and the platform was slowly rising with a humming sound. The darkness faded like a layer of gauze, and light sprinkled down from above, gradually outlining the edge of the entire abyss. On the smooth broken wall, there were countless crystal lattices that transmitted energy. Some of them were in regular lines and some were in beautiful circles. The entire wall was like an enormous machine. Every part of it was operating in an orderly manner. The platform slowly rose to the center of this space before it stopped with a buzzing sound. Ko Hua was in the center of the platform, and only then did she slowly raise her eyelids. At this moment, the black flames on her body had already scattered like falling leaves, revealing the platinum-colored body made of pure lightning below. She opened her eyes and they were snow-white. Arcs of lightning jumped from her arched face and extended to her slender neck. Her hair was purely composed of lightning bundles bound together. Feels good to be reborn. There seemed to be 2 voices echoing on the platform. One belonged to Ko Hua, and the other was rolling like thunder. The 2 voices gradually overlapped and merged into one. Just as Ko Hua opened her mouth, a bolt of lightning fell from the sky, passed through her body, and hit the platform below. Countless ionized particles exploded on the obsidian-like platform like splashes of molten steel, and poured into the deep engravings on the platform. Streaks of platinum-colored light extended in all directions along the ancient patterns, and in an instant, the entire platform seemed to have come alive. The glowing energy pipes refracted beams of holographic projections into the air. In these projections, the ancient runes flashed. Flame, Mos Aaron. These runes flowed down like rain, forming beautiful data streams and light walls. Brando was almost shocked by this scene, until Ko Hua's voice sounded again. The dispute from thousands of years ago seems to still linger in the hall above the clouds. The sad gods have to admit their failure. They have planned a future that is almost certain to be destroyed for the world you call Woned. They are about to return fate to you lowly creatures. Thousands of years later, you've defeated the dusk, but chaos has taken root in your hearts. Greed, sin, slaughter, and endless conquest, you've turned yourselves into the apocalypse that you once saw in the prophecy. The classical order has become a thing of the past. Only entropy exists forever. Today the gods have once again awakened you. Everything is back to square one. The world was born from chaos and was destroyed by chaos. Reality and prophecy are confirmed one by one. Mortals, this is your recompense. Then her voice seemed to be replaced by another emotion. You have chosen your fate again, mortals. We have personally handed the direction of fate back to you, but today you have returned here again, as if only to prove Alphonse's prophecy. You have awakened us again, and we respect your choice. The gods will return to the earth, and we will rebuild the order of the next era. And your era is over. Brando stared at this scene, as if he was watching an animation in a game. After a long while, he looked up and blurted out, "Are you Ko Hua or Milos?" Ko Hua lowered her head and looked at Brando. Two different emotions flashed in her silver-white eyes at the same time, but she finally fixed on one of them and said, "Of course I am Ko Hua. But I am also Milos." Another voice rumbled. She gently raised her arm, and in front of her, the space seemed to have been thrown with stones, rippling out in circles. After the ripples spread out, holographic projections appeared behind them. Kurlets Vales, Kronki at the border of the four territories, Toquinen of the Golden Mane Lion Mane Beastmen. He could even see the towering golden spires, White City, Thousand Sails Harbor, the rebuilt Cathedral of Ampere Seal, the Fortress of Krakor, the Elven Tip of Sonorso, the Ashen Fortress, and even the faraway Buffalo City that Brendel had only been to once in the Great Ice Age appeared in the countless images. Brendel could even see the towering golden spires, the White City, the Thousand Sails Harbor, the rebuilt Cathedral of Ampere Seal, the Fortress of Krakor, the Elven Tip of Sonorso, the Ashen Fortress, and even the faraway Buffalo City that Brendel had only been to once in the Great Ice Age. Brando's breathing became a little rapid. He stared at Ko Hua and asked, "What do you want to do?" Ko Hua looked at him proudly. "Guess?" A bolt of lightning passed through Brando's mind. "You can't do that," he shouted through gritted teeth. "Why not?" the girl's voice asked softly. Chapter 827. Kirkle Castle. For in the afternoon, Limo was jolted awake from the sofa. He looked at his coffee table, desk, and bookcase, which were shaking like they were possessed. They were moving in one direction in the room, and the teacups on the table were clinking non-stop. "It's an earthquake." Just as this terrifying thought surfaced in his mind, a loud bang sounded. The walnut door was smashed open by the guards. The one who rushed in was his trusted aide, but his expression was no better than his own. "And my lord, you better come out and take a look." "Where's the princess?" Limo jumped up from the sofa like a leopard, grabbing his aide by the collar and roaring, "Evacuate everyone!" The aide shook his head desperately. At this moment, a calm voice came from outside the door. "Mr. Knight, let him go. Calm down." The voice seemed to stab Limo, causing him to let go of his aide. He looked up and saw the half-elf girl standing behind the swaying door. Behind her were a few knights. Duke Viro was beside her in his long robe. The princess's expression was normal, and the duke did not seem to be panicking. Dust fell from the ceiling like smoke from time to time, landing on the two of them, but no one cared. Limo's face reddened. He did not expect the princess to be here. He had been sleeping too soundly. "Your Highness, we have to leave the building quickly," he suggested. "No need. This is not an earthquake," Princess Graphine replied. "Mr. Knight, take your men and inform the wizards of the Tower of Stars and Moon to activate the city's magical defenses." Magical defenses? Limo was stunned. Could it be that they were attacked? He subconsciously looked at the others suspiciously. Graphine sighed, but only the aide approached him carefully and whispered in his ear, "My lord, you'll understand once you go out and take a look." Wallerstein, 3:55 p.m. The alarm bell on the Holy Cathedral tower rang, and the Griffin guards immediately rose into the sky and flew in all directions. In the outskirts of the town, the lush forest seemed to have been blown by a gust of wind. The emerald-green treetops rolled in waves, revealing the gray-white leaves below. The shockwaves passed through the clouds in the sky and tore the cotton-like clouds into pieces. The monk soldiers came out in full force and walked up the city wall in a long line. In the four directions of the city center, the minarets were shining with strong magic light. In the blink of an eye, a light purple hemispherical screen of light appeared above the city, covering the entire area from Mandolin Market to the Watergate. Looking down at the city from the sky, the panicked crowd was gathering along the streets towards the city center, as if some invisible fear was driving them forward. In the central plaza, Consul Kanan looked up with a pale face, as if he was facing the end of the world. "Martha above, please protect your people." Right behind him, the security chief's roar sounded like the roar of an angry dragon. "You damned idiots, what are you doing here? Go and inform the headquarters of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Get out. Tell them we're done for. All done for. Let them find out who did it. Who cast this spell." The patrolling cavalry scattered in all directions. Toquinen Fortress for 10 in the afternoon. In contrast to the tense atmosphere in Waller, The Golden Lion City seemed to have been cast into a spell of silence that enveloped the entire city. The whole city was still. Every street, every square, and even the entrances of the bazaars and shops, the lion men with long manes, the dwarves with axes, and the halflings in the grey wilderness were all like puppets under a spell. Everyone looked up at the sky in a daze. In the sky there were still dark clouds, but it was as if a circle of ripples was spreading out with the city as the center. All the dark clouds were instantly dispersed in all directions. The shockwaves spread out layer by layer, and the thick clouds were torn apart and rolled. In the end, they turned into light clouds in the shape of fish scales and were still drifting into the distant sky. The sky behind the clouds was blue, and the sun shone down directly. It was as clear as the surface of a still lake, without a single blemish. There were no clouds for thousands of miles. The golden steeple of the Asamoah Temple shone brightly under the sun. But no one cheered, no one praised such a miracle, and no one even dared to make a sound. The doors of the Golden Palace opened, and the elderly lion-men priests walked out of the temple with the help of the accompanying monks. Their white robes were like waves. But everyone looked at the sky, and almost lost their souls as they knelt down and prayed for the forgiveness of the gods. In the dark blue sky, the white lines of the Tiamat magic array were as clear as a magic array diagram drawn on a blackboard with chalk, but the arcs of different thicknesses did not intersect with each other. Each of the arcs spanned half the sky and had a diameter of more than 10,000 miles. The lines were a little like white trails coming out from the light clouds in the distance, crossing the top of the head, and then connecting to the other side of the sky. A few vertical lines connected to the center of the circle of the entire magic array. Such a spectacular scene could only be seen on the most sunny days. But today, such a scene only made the people who were watching it feel suffocated. The white magic array was overlapping, as if they were moving horizontally from the other half of the sky. Although there was no sound, it was as loud as rolling thunder in people's hearts. The magic array overlapped one another, and every time it moved, it swept across hundreds of miles of the sky. Finally, these rotating gears were aimed at the Toquinen fortress. Heavy pressure descended from the sky. At that moment, everyone in the city involuntarily prostrated themselves. It was as if they were listening to the teachings of the gods. Maynard looked up. The buzzing sound was getting louder and louder, and the folded sword knights were slowly retreating. But it was at this moment that several people present felt an indescribable feeling in their hearts. It was as if they were witnessing some kind of indescribable majestic power breaking out of its cocoon. Maynard, Little Pero, and the others, who were the last to retreat, turned their heads in unison. As if all of a sudden, there was a slight flash of light, and everyone saw a circle of faint light gathering from all directions. It seemed slow, but in fact it was very fast. Little Pero could tell at a glance that the light pattern started near Violet Castle in the west, and reached Kirkle in the east. It covered a range of hundreds of miles in the blink of an eye. The light wave swept across their position with a buzzing sound, and gathered at the center of the black building complex. It was just a blink of an eye. The light pattern completely gathered together, forming a dazzling ball of light. Then a beam of light rose straight from the center of the ball of light, and with a buzzing sound, it directly pierced through the clouds in the sky. The clouds were turbulent like waves, rippling layer by layer. Just the aftermath alone was enough to shock everyone to the core. This is... Ko Hua only touched it lightly with his hand. There was only pure white left in the image, and the white light spread out from the point where the beam of light fell like a tsunami, flooding the entire city. The towering towers, the city walls, the fortress, and the iconic golden minaret of Toquinen were all submerged in the dazzling light. There was no earth-shattering explosion, no sound of houses collapsing, no screams, no fire, only a flawless white light, just like the light that Martha descended when the world was born. After the light faded, Toquinen, the fortress that the lionfolk were proud of, was completely erased from this world, and there was not a trace of its existence left. The 34,000 lionfolk, dwarves, and halflings that lived in this city were all turned into ashes. In the grasslands of Toquinen, there was only a deep pit a few miles in diameter left. Smoke curled up from the pit, bearing witness to everything that happened just a moment ago. Brando stared at the scene with his mouth agape. Judgment of God. A 14-circle light elemental sorcery. Ko Hua did not even blink, and pointed his finger at another image, Waller's. "You're crazy," Brando roared. He stared at the other two images in fear. Ampere Seal Kirkle. Princess Graphene was still in Kirkle. Ko Hua turned around and looked at him with his silver-white eyes that had become emotionless and asked, "Why do you say that, Mr. Human? Aren't you the ones who woke me up?" Her voice echoed in the hall, without a hint of guilt or excitement, as if that was all there was to it. "The ones who woke you up were the believers of All for One. What does it have to do with us? Those people are innocent." The believers of All for One are the generation of Black Iron, and have the power to decide the fate of the world. They are a group of scum whose minds have been corrupted by dusk. So you have turned yourselves into the messengers of destruction. Ko Hua smiled proudly. "Damn it." Brando flew up and slashed his sword at Ko Hua above the platform, but when the blade was still 10 feet away from her, there was a buzz as if it had hit a wall of air. The space that was hit shook violently, and with the point of contact as the center, ripples of hexagonal light rippled out. Ko Hua glanced at him and moved her left hand in his direction. A circle of blazing white static electricity spread out with her as the center. Brando screamed and was directly bounced out, landing heavily on the ground. With just that, he lost a quarter of his life. He immediately gritted his teeth and got up from the ground, but it was at this time that a hand pressed down on his shoulder from behind. Even Brando himself did not notice when Veronica and Mephisto had come up behind him. The two sword saints put Peya and Yeruda down. The two siblings had probably fainted again during the fall, and had yet to wake up. The two of them raised their heads at the same time and looked at Ko Hua in the center of the hall. "Brando, what's going on?" In the end, it was Veronica who asked first. "Stop her, she's destroying the cities on the projection. She's now controlling Milo's body and can use Milo's divine power at will." Brando took a breath and immediately replied. Seeing Veronica and his teacher arrive, he was finally relieved. Now the strength of the three of them combined was not inferior to the entire team of around level 50 in the game. Veronica recognized Volez on the holographic projection at a glance. Her expression changed, and without any movement, the thin sword in the scabbard automatically came out of the scabbard and appeared in her hand. Brando glanced at the sword. It was not the Azure Firmament but just a high-quality magic sword. Only then did he realize that the female commander's strength seemed to have grown a little. He did not know if it was the influence of the experience in the loop of trade winds or the great demonic wave. "A complete true god?" Mephisto frowned and asked. Hearing this question, Brando calmed down. No, from what Ko Hua said before, she should still be in the process of merging with Milo's body. In this state, she could at most be considered a false god. However, even if she was a fake god, there was still a qualitative difference between her and a mortal. The barrier of light around her was the legendary divine barrier. Attacks from the mortal world would never be able to penetrate this barrier. But damn it, how was this battle supposed to be fought? If even Ko Hua himself could not be attacked, then wouldn't it be a one-sided slaughter? Impossible. If Ko Hua was really the legendary hidden boss, the awakening god Surash, then there must be a flaw. Brando narrowed his eyes. He had already seen Veronica rushing toward Ko Hua. Her speed was astonishing. Like a green shadow, she circled behind Ko Hua in the blink of an eye. She stopped there, raised her long sword, and crossed it in front of her. A green dragon flew out of the blade and went straight for Ko Hua. However, just like Brando's previous attack, the moment the green dragon hit the light screen, a hexagonal grid appeared in layers. The dragon instantly disintegrated, and then a ring of static energy bounced off the light screen. But this ring of static energy was cut in half by the green sword saint's sword before it could get close to Veronica. It did not affect her at all. In a breath's time, Veronica had finished her attack and counterattack. She landed lightly beside Brando, frowning deeply. Absolute difference? She looked at Brando. Brando nodded. Absolute difference was the natural chasm between all mortal power and divine power. This was the core law of the Tiamat law, divine power, also known as the absolute law. The power of existence took precedence over all laws and order. Only the power of existence could affect the gods. The power of mortals was like a bubble at this level. No matter how brilliant it was meaningless. She's not a true god. How can there be an absolute difference between us? Veronica almost gritted her teeth as she asked this question. Brando shook his head blankly. Indeed, Kohua was not a true god. How could there be an absolute difference? But that divine barrier was clearly a type of absolute difference. Moreover, if there was such a thing as an absolute difference, how could this battle be fought? He felt that there must be a problem somewhere. A battle of this level would not be prepared for players. He looked around trying to find the hidden flaw. But at this moment he had a vague idea in his mind. This was a world quest. The world line in the game was split into two. The players in the past had chosen the former path, but he had accidentally chosen the latter. The future line had been completely changed, but whether it was good or bad was unknown. Chapter 828. In the underground of the abyss, after the ice layer fell off, the dark artificial buildings around gradually became clear. On the smooth obsidian wall, a platinum light was extending along the notches, and soon the entire corridor was lit up. Alaz and Medisha walked curiously along the corridor, but the two had been lost for a long time. We seem to have been walking in circles, Sister Alaz. The little female dragon's face turned red, but she held the star-shaped stone with one hand and waved her claws. Showing her little fangs, she replied, "How is that possible? You must have remembered wrongly." Medisha smiled. "Yes," she nodded and smiled. "Just like in the wild of the Four Realms, the reason why we haven't reached our destination yet is because we are walking too slowly." Alaz seemed to have been electrocuted. She turned around and stared at Medisha with wide eyes. You, how did you know?" "I also know that you were the youngest dragon on the battlefield of the War of the Holy Saints, Sister Alaz. In Moros, you snuck out on a date with Lord Flora, and were caught by the Wind Elf guards, and Lord Eloranta gave you a good scolding," Medisha whispered. "Do you remember what she said at the time? How can you get lost on a tryst? How can my subordinates be so much worse than Gretel and Saint Tossel? How embarrassing, get lost." The little fairy princess imitated the scene vividly. Alaz opened her mouth slightly like a puppy, showing her sharp fangs. Her face was like a ripe apple. "Impossible, how could anyone know about this? You, who are you?" Medisha tilted her head, smiled and did not answer. "Ah!" Alaz suddenly screamed. She looked at her with some surprise. "I remember, it's you, Princess Crescent. Why did you change your name to such a strange one?" "That's my surname, Sister Alaz." Medisha sighed. "My real name is Medisha." The little female dragon stuck out her tongue, and replied with some annoyance, "You've changed." Medisha touched her forehead. "Sister Alaz, I am a heroic spirit. My appearance will not change." "Is that so?" Alaz scratched her round cheeks. "Then I probably remembered wrongly." "So let me lead the way," Medisha replied. "Just like when we worked together before." "Okay." But Alaz did not answer. Instead, she raised a finger and pressed it against Medissa's lips. "Shoo!" she said. "Do you hear something?" Medissa was shocked and quickly took a small step back, glaring at her. "Really there?" The little female dragon quickly replied. "Really?" The silver elf princess raised her eyebrows slightly. She knew that the five senses of the golden race were much more sensitive than other races, but suddenly her pointed ears twitched. Both of them turned their heads in a certain direction at the same time. There was a crossroad in the long corridor, and a battered figure was limping slowly from there. After a while, Alaz and Medisha revealed themselves from the invisibility spell. "That guy looks familiar." The little female dragon showed her teeth. "Suspicious." "It's Dukarek," Medisha replied. She and Alaz looked at each other. The white beam of light pierced through heaven and earth. Maynard and the others turned their heads and stared in that direction from afar. The second time, Veronica looked angrily at Kohua as another image in front of her was drowned in the white light. Levas, the border city of Cruz, had been reduced to ashes. She was so angry that she almost crushed the hilt of her sword, but Brando held on tightly to the female commander, afraid that she would lose her mind. The three of them had launched many attacks on Kohua, but they had all returned without success. The divine barrier was like a wall of despair, lying between mortals and gods. There was no way to break through. Kohua turned her gaze to the next image, Uskin, a city of wind elves. Brando looked nervously at the rapidly changing images. There were still two more images, the beautiful castle on the shore of Lake Kirkle. He was so nervous that his palms were sweating. How could there be such a battle? He had to think of a way. At this time, Ko-hwa suddenly looked up, as if looking at something. Her voice once again echoed on the platform. Sister, you're here. Brando was slightly startled. He turned his head and saw the figures of the young prince and Prince Lenoret appear on the cliff. Teacher. Lady Veronica. His and Shido's voices were the first to reach him, and then Brando saw another Ko-hwa appear behind them. The dark side of Ko-hwa in the middle of the hall frowned, while the kind Ko-hwa just nodded gently. Could the key to the battle be the kind Ko-hwa? This thought flashed through Brando's mind. She is? Mephistopheles asked. That is also Ko-hwa. The one controlling Milos is her dark soul. 1 and 2. Brando nodded. Something like that. Ah, wait. He was surprised to see that Veronica had already charged in that direction. Obviously, this female army commander had thought of the same thing, but the problem was that Veronica was much more decisive than him. But by the time he reacted, the tip of Veronica's sword was almost in front of Ko-hwa's face. The kind Ko-hwa was almost stunned. Her eyes widened, and she just stood there in a daze, not understanding why this human woman attacked her indiscriminately as soon as she saw her. Of course, even if she was not stunned, she might not be able to dodge Veronica's sword. After all, one was a spellcaster and the other was a warrior. In close combat, there was no comparison at all. Ko-hwa opened her mouth slightly, and just as Veronica's sword was about to pierce through her heart, Brando's anxious shout finally came. Haruz, stop her! Without thinking, the young prince pulled out his sword to stop her, but Veronica did not even look at him. The difference between the two was not on the same level. The young prince had just pulled out his sword when he felt a gentle force on his hand. Before he could react, the long sword had already flown out of his hand, and with a clang it stabbed into the ceiling of the cave. But it was only a slight delay, and the kind Korfa finally reacted. She let out a low cry of "Ah!" and fell back onto the ground in fright. Veronica's cyan sword aura flew over Ko-hwa's head, only cutting off a few strands of hair. She frowned and prepared to attack again, but at this moment, Ko-hwa's dark attack finally arrived. How dare you! The dark Ko-hwa's voice rumbled, and a white electric whip lashed out at Veronica. Veronica did not dare to block it directly, so she could only lean to the side and let the electric whip hit the cliff, cutting off a table-sized fragment from the solid wall. And with this delay, Veronica finally lost the chance to continue attacking the kind Ko-hwa. She could not help but turn around and glare at Brando. But Brando only felt relieved. In fact, he had already thought it through. The key to this battle was definitely not Ko-hwa. Ko-hwa came to this platform because of him and the young prince. The key to this battle was definitely not a factor that could only appear on the battlefield. In other words, if Ko-hwa did not appear, this battle could not be fought? This was obviously illogical. He hurriedly gestured to Veronica, indicating that he had something to explain. But at this moment, Brando saw the fragment that Ko-hwa's electric whip had swept down behind Veronica tumbling down. It hit one of the energy transmission pipes, and with a crack it caved in. The pipe suddenly flashed, and the light on it was quickly extinguished. Seeing this, Brando's heart skipped a beat. I know, so it's here. He immediately looked up and shouted to Mephisto and Veronica. Attack the platform. Attack those pipes. The Ash Sword Saint and Veronica were slightly startled and looked at him with some confusion. Clearly, they did not understand for a moment. Brando was so anxious that he could not help but shout. She Ko-hwa is just a false god. She has no divine barrier at all. The absolute difference in her body comes from Milos. Her power comes from this platform. Right now, she has not completely merged with Milos' body. It will be fine as long as she is cut off from the platform. As soon as Brando's voice fell, Dark Ko-hwa, who was above the platform, changed her expression. Don't joke around, you guessed wrong. She hurriedly defended herself. Veronica and Mephisto looked at each other and immediately flew to the left and right sides of the energy transmission network scattered to the left and right sides of the platform. With a few flashes of sword light, dozens of energy transmission pipes were cut in the middle. The disordered magic flow formed a pulse like a nova explosion. In the blink of an eye, several huge holes were blasted in the dense network. Damn it! Ko-hwa screamed. She could no longer maintain her calm. She raised her hands and countless lightning bolts appeared out of thin air on the platform, like raindrops striking toward Brando, Mephisto, and Veronica. Mephisto and Veronica were fine. They could deal with these lightning attacks with a little distraction, but Brando was in a bit of trouble. It seemed that the other party was retaliating against him for finding out that weakness. Almost half of the lightning bolts were aimed at him. He only blocked 2 or 3 before the fourth hit him directly. His body went numb and he was immediately bathed in the lightning storm. If it were not for his ridiculously high will, he would probably be sent to see Martha directly. But even so, the dense lightning bolt still took away almost 2/3 of his HP. More importantly, his clothes were now like that of a beggar's. Brando did not know whether to laugh or cry. He knew that this AoE attack should be shared by everyone in the party, but now there were only 3 of them in the party, and Kohua saw him as the number 1 target. He could only blame himself for being unlucky. After the lightning storm, Veronica and Mephisto launched another attack. But this time Kohua was smarter. She simply gave up on attacking altogether. Instead, she channeled all her energy into the ground and supported a strong protective shield over the pipes. In the beginning, Brando could cut through several pipes with a single slash. But after Kohua cast the shield, she might not be able to cut through even one pipe. He looked back and saw that the progress of Veronica and Mephisto had been greatly reduced. However, Brando felt that Kohua's brain was probably a little off. Although she did greatly slow them down, the problem was that if she did not attack, the pipes would be cut through one by one. Of course, Brando was happy to see the boss being stupid. No one would complain that their boss battle was too easy. Besides, he vaguely felt that the problem was not so simple. Please wait a moment. Scarlet heard the voice behind her and turned back. She glanced at the young man who had caught up from behind. She remembered that he seemed to have introduced himself as Babarn or something else. The name sounded a little strange to her. Erwin rarely had such a name, so she had a deeper impression of it. The young man ran, panting. He probably had something urgent to attend to. The Highlander girl stared at him blankly. After a while, she remembered that she should be the one asking the question. What's the matter? Beautiful lady, I still don't know your name. Scarlet frowned. What does my name have to do with you? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. I just wanted to thank you. The young man replied breathlessly. He faintly felt the hostility of the other party. He was a little surprised but immediately added. Thank me? Yes, thank you for saving us. I can't not repay you for saving my life. Scarlet thought for a moment. Babarn seemed a little nervous. He did not know why, but he always felt that he could not move freely in front of the other party. At first, he thought that it was because the other party was too much to his liking. But after spending some time together, he began to gradually feel that there seemed to be a strange temperament in the other party, faintly exuding a frightening aura. Of course, he did not know that the blood of the dragon and the thunder god flowed in Scarlet's body at the same time. He vaguely felt that the Countess's handmaiden was a little unusual. He suddenly felt a little nervous and began to regret that he should not have agreed to work with those guys. At this time, Scarlet finally recovered from her daze. She looked up at the surrounding cliffs and asked as if she was referring to something. You said that you want to thank me. Is this how you thank me? The young man was slightly stunned. But Scarlet had already picked up the halberd in her hand and pointed in all directions of the underground glacier. These rats hiding in the corner. Are they your companions? Babarn's face changed. At the same time, the faces of the noble soldiers who were pointed out by the mountain girl did not look good. They awkwardly walked out from the shadows and looked at the girl with some surprise. Only the leader of the group applauded and praised dryly. This is really beyond our expectations. I didn't expect the young lady to be a real master. Scarlet looked at these people quietly and frowned, but she was secretly prepared to be on guard. After all, she was a mercenary. Just by looking at the position of these people, she knew that they were not friendly. Don't worry, the man continued. We do want to thank the young lady. We hope that the young lady will come with us to cruise as a guest. The Empire has always been hospitable. We will definitely treat you well. Babarn quickly nodded. Yes, we won't embarrass you. We just want to ask you for a favor. A favor? Yes, beautiful lady. If you agree, I will personally ask His Majesty to restore your freedom. You will become a free citizen of Cruz. You will not have to bow to anyone. Besides, with your ability, it is not impossible for you to become a noble of the empire. Babarn explained. But never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that he had said something wrong. In fact, just as he finished saying that he would let her regain her freedom, he saw that the eyes of the seemingly innocent mountain girl were already glinting with the ferocity of a wild beast. P.S. Today is 10:7 chapters updated, a total of 13,000 words. After today, the stable updates will be restored, but I will consider adding more on weekends and Sundays. Also, I am looking for monthly votes. Chapter 8:30. Babarn felt Scarlet suddenly disappear in front of him. He immediately reacted. She did not disappear, but the mountain girl had passed him and circled behind him, but she was too fast. His eyes widened slightly, and he turned his head stiffly, only to see a fiery red afterimage in the corner of his eye. It was the end of a long ponytail. Behind Viscount Babarn, the Kurlutzian noble who had been leading the agitation saw this scene more clearly. In his eyes, the mountain girl was still negotiating with Babarn a moment ago, but suddenly, she had moved away from the latter by a body's length. His left foot stepped lightly on the ground, his whole body tilted to the same side. The blade of the spear in his hand was one step ahead, and a cold light flashed. The girl looked up and stared at him. A circle of golden flame seemed to be burning from the inside out. Her crimson ponytail danced with her movements, like a dancing feather scarf. In the blink of an eye, the fire dragon was already in front of him. Not good. The Cruz noble's hair stood on end, and he subconsciously raised the long sword in his hand. Clang! A line of sparks crossed, and the Kurlutzian noble staggered back. The force from the spear was so great that he had to hold his sword with both hands to block it, but in the same way, this also made him lose the chance to fight back. The Cruz noble was covered in cold sweat, and there was only one thought in his mind: so fast. Never in his wildest dreams would he have thought that this seemingly weak and introverted girl would attack him without saying a word. And her target wasn't Babarn but him. How did she see through it? He looked at the sword in his hand with lingering fear, and there was a deep cut on the blade. The Cruz noble's hands were shaking. Scarlet immediately retreated when her attack missed. She frowned slightly. She originally wanted to take the leader by surprise, but she didn't expect the other party to react so quickly. The Kurlutzian soldiers were indeed worthy of their reputation. Stop her! Only then did someone react. To be able to survive the previous fall under the ice, all the survivors were at least of the gold level. Even the leading noble and Viscount Babarn had the same elemental awakening strength as Scarlet, because they did not feel threatened at first. 7 or 8 people against one, and the opponent was a woman. No matter how they thought about it, it was not dangerous at all. But they never thought that Scarlet was no longer a human in the simple sense. To be precise, her bloodline had long surpassed the Black Iron generation. The Cruz nobles roared in unison, and at the same time, the long swords in their hands flashed into a cold light, blocking Scarlet's retreat from all directions. Only then did people remember that they were not only of outstanding swordsmen, but also well-trained soldiers. But unfortunately, their opponent was Scarlet. The mountain girl had arguably the most outstanding and unique swordsmanship training partner in the world. Brando was familiar with the Cruz, Erwin, Fanzan, and even the undead of Madara, the wind elves of Saint Tossol, each of the most mainstream swordsmanship in this era. Even more than that, he had a lot of ways to deal with each swordsmanship. As soon as the Cruz noble soldiers moved, Scarlet had already reacted. She stepped lightly on the ground while retreating quickly, and with one foot as an axis she turned around, and the spear in her hand had already drawn a semicircle, forcing the Cruz nobles who were approaching from the right to retreat. At the same time, the girl had already lowered her center of gravity, and with the other foot on the ground, she suddenly burst out from the ground, shooting forward like a sharp arrow. She chose the direction of the left wing, where the encirclement was weaker. There were only 3 swordsmen in that direction, and one of them was only at the beginning of the gold level. And her target happened to be this person. The man was already stunned. The speed of the mountain girl's dash had exceeded everyone's expectations, and was at least 3 times faster than the peak of the gold level. Every time Scarlet's foot touched the ground, A long arc of electricity would be drawn out. In the eyes of outsiders, it was as if a bolt of lightning was leaping continuously on the ground. The bright electric light continued to bend, as if it was splitting the darkness, and in an instant, she had already arrived in front of the crew's noble. In the man's vision, only the bright golden flames in the girl's eyes were left. The spear pierced through his chest, and the crew's noble did not have time to let out a scream of pain before it was stuck in his throat. Blood gushed out from his lungs, turning into a gurgling sound, and then he spat out a mouthful of blood foam. The girl pressed a hand on his chest and pushed, and the guy's body was thrown out like a tattered rag doll. She's hiding her strength. The head of the nobles was buzzing in his head. No, this is definitely not the power of elemental activation. That's 2 levels of existence. This little girl's strength is still at the gold level, but why is there such a huge difference? He could not figure it out no matter how hard he racked his brain, and did not think of the dragon race at all. Because if Scarlet was a dragon, first of all, she would never be a servant of humans, and secondly, she would not have to play a game of cat and mouse with them here. Unfortunately, no one would have thought that Scarlet's current situation was a result of a conspiracy and an unexpected prank. Scarlet had already torn the line of defense, but she was still not out of danger. She looked back and saw that the crew's noble was still approaching, and one on the left and one on the right were the 2 noble soldiers she had left behind, and the one chasing after her was the leader. She simply raised her left hand, her fingers slightly closed, and made a strangling gesture. Everyone saw that in an instant Scarlet's left arm seemed to have turned into pure energy, and turned into a blazing platinum color. Arcs of electricity surrounded her arm, and then suddenly, with a sizzling sound, shot towards the 3 of them. Elemental materialization. The noble soldier on the left was shocked, and quickly rolled to the side to avoid the attack. But his companion was not so lucky, and was directly hit in the chest by the electric arrow. He spat out a mouthful of blood and flew back, crashing into the crowd. The people behind hurriedly helped him up, and found that the guy's breastplate had been penetrated and melted, and the soft tissue behind had been completely carbonized. His eyes were wide open, and his eyes were staring unfocused at the top of the hole. Apparently, he had gone to see Martha. The leader of the nobles was shocked and angry, and he slashed the lightning with his sword. His sword was wrapped in orange lines of the law, and it tore the lightning apart like cotton wool, dissipating into countless arcs of electricity. At this time, Scarlet no longer held back, and her whole body was wrapped in electric arcs, as if half of her body had turned into blazing white lightning. Her speed was further increased to a level that the crew's nobles had never imagined in their lives. It was like a beam of light in the dark, and there was no stopping it. The nobles looked at this scene, stunned. It was not that they had never seen this kind of skill before, but it was a special skill of the lightning element and the air element. How could it appear on a human? Even if it was the law of lightning, it only allowed humans to control lightning. How could she turn it into lightning? Everything in front of them was simply subverting their understanding of the law. The glaring lightning had already drawn a beautiful arc in the darkness. In fact, semi-elementization was an ability that Scarlet had accidentally mastered after entering the elemental awakening. According to Brando, this ability itself was not something that could be found, and generally only existed in those races that were close to the elements. Very few humans could obtain this ability. He suspected that the high tolerance of the dragon blood in Scarlet's body further catalyzed the power of the thunder god's blood, and gave Scarlet a part of the elemental bloodline. It was just that Scarlet did not have the same attribute panel as him, or he would have seen it in the racial talent column. Unfortunately, semi-elementization required a certain amount of time, or she could have used this ability to break through the encirclement from the beginning. Why is she turning back? The leader of the nobles looked at the long arc in the dark in surprise. She's coming to fight us. Damn it, Babarn, you've pissed her off, she's going to kill us. Cruz's noble soldiers suddenly panicked and shouted. They thought they were just dealing with a little girl, but in the blink of an eye, the little girl had turned into a big bad wolf with fangs, and they had become Little Red Riding Hood. The difference in status was too great, and they could not accept it for a while. Shut up. Babarn was also sweating profusely. He still had a good impression of Scarlet, and the fact that she was so powerful made him both surprised and happy. He was surprised that today's battle would end, and happy that he was more and more satisfied with this mountain girl. However, he still couldn't figure out what he had said that had angered the other party. Although his words were somewhat threatening, it wasn't as if they couldn't be accepted. How could a maid have such a bad temper? How could the Count stand it? But at least Babarn was not wrong about one thing. Scarlet was completely enraged. She moved forward in her lightning form and shot straight into the crowd. The girl's pointed face had completely turned into an energy body similar to the deified Ko Hua, and her hair and eyebrows were like platinum electric beams dancing in the wind, especially her long ponytail, which looked amazingly beautiful. Scarlet's brows were deeply furrowed, and her golden eyes were burning with anger. There was only one thought in her mind at the moment. Kill these annoying people. Since the disbandment of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, Scarlet almost all of her thoughts were placed on protecting her remaining companions. Since most of them joined and became Brando's private army, she also chose to silently follow the somewhat unfamiliar young noble. And the mountain girl, Scarlet of the Grey Wolves mercenaries, from that moment on in fact had passed away, and no longer existed in this world. She began to become silent, and practiced her combat skills all day long, or in a daze, and no one knew what she was thinking. Because even she did not understand what was going on in her mind. Perhaps she was thinking about the strange words of the Count, who sometimes did not seem like a noble, but sometimes was more noble than all the other nobles. To control one's own destiny, how could one control it? Day after day she made herself colder, better at fighting, and less trusting of others, as if she was a machine, but her heart became more and more fragile. Sometimes she even felt that she was walking alone in the wilderness, standing alone. When she looked around, the original world seemed to have collapsed. More than once, Scarlet shed tears alone in the night, sobbing softly. Everything that had happened in the past 10 years was like a stretched shadow of a nightmare, and she could not get rid of it. But until that day when the strange Count handed the golden apple to her, and told her that no matter what, he would not give up on her, and in that dark dream there was finally a ray of warm light. It was something that even Lord Makarov, Lord Fleetwood, and everyone who betrayed the Grey Wolves mercenaries wanted, but the Count just gave it to her because of a promise. She was not good with words, and she did not know how to repay him. She just wanted to be by his side silently. Because of this, she became even more silent. Until today, when these disgusting cruise people in front of her wanted to destroy her only hope, her anger had completely drowned all of her rationality. These people must die. 2 screams, a noble soldier's head fell to the ground, and another soldier screamed and held his arm. Below his wrist, it was already charred black, and the brittle bones seemed to be unable to bear the weight of the longsword. The falling longsword broke his arm, and it turned into black powder and fell to the ground together. The leader of the nobles was sweating profusely, and he turned back to Babarn and shouted, "Babarn, if you don't do something, there will be no end to this." Babarn cursed silently, thinking that the current situation was also because of this guy. He secretly regretted it. Originally, these people's conspiracy had nothing to do with him, but he did want to invite this mountain girl back to the Kurlet's empire as a guest. He felt that it was love at first sight, and he wanted to make her his woman no matter what, but he never dreamed that things would develop to this point. He sighed, and had to take out a folded crossbow from his sleeve. At this point he had no choice but to use this thing. He loaded the crossbow and raised it. At this time Scarlet turned into a flash of lightning and crossed the crowd of Crew's nobles. Babarn immediately turned and aimed in that direction. He did not aim accurately, of course, with Scarlet's current speed. There was no point in aiming accurately. The Viscount muttered something, and the pattern on the crossbow in his hand suddenly lit up one by one. In the amber sword, magic weapons that can be activated by themselves must be silver items of ancient grade or above, but this crossbow was not just that. In fact, it was a big deal. If Brando was here, he would definitely recognize the identity of this crossbow, and further recognize Babarn's identity. Unfortunately, Scarlet was not Brando, and the girl was still unaware at this moment. A silver light pierced through the darkness. Scarlet suddenly felt a huge force coming from behind, and the severe pain almost instantly broke her semi-elemental state. The lightning wrapped around her suddenly exploded, forming a dazzling electric spark. The mountain girl fell forward like a kite with a broken string, and hit the ice hard. Although she immediately gritted her teeth and got up, Everyone saw that the crossbow bolt was stuck in her waist. The girl gritted her teeth, covered the place with one hand, and used the other hand to support her body with the spear. She was trembling so much that she could barely stand. The noble soldiers cheered in unison. Scarlet's vision turned black. Of course she heard the cheers, although the sound seemed to come from the sky, but what made her feel even colder was that the noble soldiers had already surrounded her from the left and right. She gasped softly and felt a salty taste in her mouth, but she still subconsciously clenched her teeth and clenched the spear in her hand. Those pipes should be for Ko-Hwa's sister to channel magic. We should find a way to help the Count and the others cut off those pipes. Miss Scholar was lying on the edge of the ice wall, staring at the battle below, but when she said this, she was a little concerned about the expression of Ko-Hwa beside them. The latter smiled at her, indicating that it was nothing. After getting the nod, Shido was relieved and asked, "Your Royal Highness, do you have any ideas?" Lenoret nodded. He glanced down, although his face was still expressionless. The level of the battle below is not something we can get involved in. If we go down, we will only be a burden to Teacher and Count Tonajul. Fortunately, we don't need to go down to participate in the battle. I have a bow, Shido. You can still use magic. Let's do it before that woman notices us. With that said, His Royal Highness also glanced at Brando below, with a rare look of envy in his eyes. He was slightly older than Brando, but the other's strength was really not something to be jealous of. A 20-year-old knight of the Holy Cathedral, how shocking it would be if word got out. Fortunately, the higher-ups of the two countries who knew about this were actually only the core figures. The Holy Cathedral of Fire should be very clear about the news contained in this information, and they would not spread it casually. After all, the other party was not Cruz's people, but this was also the most unfortunate part. He now slightly understood Veronica's thoughts, but fortunately, this Count Tonajul had a good relationship with them. He was nominally Veronica's student, and his political orientation was also supported by the Palucci family. Brando was close to Veronica, so he was naturally a friend of his faction. "What about me?" Haruz asked. "You stay here and help us keep an eye on the surroundings," Larinat replied. "Huh." The little prince opened his mouth wide, and he hurriedly shook his head vigorously. "Teacher is still fighting down there. How can I just stand by and watch?" "This is not standing by and watching. His Royal Highness is right. Little prince, you have to keep an eye on this time. Don't let those guys from All for One guys make trouble behind us." A voice suddenly came from the ice cave behind them. "You don't think we're the only ones down here, do you?" Prince Haruz's eyes lit up slightly, and he turned back in surprise and shouted, "Mr. the Shire." Then he froze for a moment and added, "Sister Hippamera." Coming out from behind the ice cave were two of Brando's 3 planeswalker summons. Oh! Chapter 831. Brando was naturally overjoyed by the sudden appearance of the Shire and Hippamera, but Dark Ko-Hwa was not necessarily so. In fact, the current situation was not very optimistic for her. In addition to Brando, Mephisto and Veronica were both extremely good at swordsmanship with a wide range of damage. In their hands, even if the platform was equipped with magical protection, it could only hold up for a while, but it was still decreasing at a speed visible to the naked eye. In just a moment, more than a third of it was gone. At this moment, the Shire and Hippamera, who were slowly floating down from the cliff one after another, were serious spellcasters and spellcasters. Whether it was elementalists or law wizards or even witches or summoners, they were all masters of ranged attacks, even if they were spellcasters such as priests, and priests. At least they were much more professional than warriors. After a series of battles, especially after sharing the huge amount of experience from the battle between Maine and Mare, the Shire and Hippamera had reached level 39 at this time. In fact, they could already be regarded as early gold rank. Although they were far from their peak level, it was more than enough to cut the pipe. Plus Lenoret, a genuine gold rank, and Shido, the other half of a spellcaster. Even if they only helped with long-range attacks, Dark Ko-Hwa's defense soon became precarious. The situation was not optimistic. She suddenly became anxious and shouted angrily, "Sister, are you just going to watch outsiders deal with me?" Everyone was stunned, especially Shido and the others, who hurriedly looked back at Ko-Hwa. But the latter frowned and shook her head, replying, "I won't participate in the battle. That's not what I yearn for." "Sister, give up unrealistic wishes. The gods no longer belong to this world. I know you want to take the opportunity to early. Some let dusk come, but dusk is dusk after all. It represents the eternity of the sea of chaos. It doesn't matter if it's earlier or later. This in itself is an immutable truth. Resurrecting me, isn't this someone's choice? Mortals are always full of themselves. I'm just following Milo's wishes and teaching them a lesson. Two voices answered. The dark Kohua gritted his teeth and sneered. Of course, I'm happy to see this happen. Milos wants to follow his agreement with the crystal and the dark dragon. When the gods are resurrected, he will let them go. The world was repeating the classical order. As for me, I'm merely tasting the taste of destruction. We each take what we need. This is not contradictory. But there are more people here who don't want to see the revival of the gods. You can't let them only choose one, Kohua answered. Dark Kohua was speechless. Forget it. I'm not going to argue with you about these meaningless things. Anyway, I don't expect you to stand with me. Just watch and see how I deal with these insects. Brando landed steadily on one of the pipes. He knew that Kohua must have a backup plan. A boss battle couldn't be that simple, not to mention this was a hidden boss. Or according to the game, they hadn't even passed the first stage of the boss. The tip of the Halran Gaia stood between his legs. Between his feet, he pressed down with both hands, firmly holding the gauntlet, and then looked up at the newborn goddess in the center of the platform. Teacher Brando, watch out for your head. Haru's tender voice came from above. Lenoret asked him to help monitor the movements around. He didn't expect it to come in handy at this moment. But what he saw was not the black-robed knight of all for one, but dozens of heavy constructs descending from the sky. The light above the platform almost dimmed slightly. Two golems clad in heavy armor and wielding double-headed greatswords with a pair of wings made of 6 luminous feathers behind their armor slowly descended in a circle, one after the other. Blazing wings. It turned out to be this kind of thing to drive them away. Dark Kohua's voice echoed in the hall. But don't kill them. I want them to witness with their own eyes how the order of this era ends. Red light flashed under the helmets of the 32 constructs, and the wings on their backs spread out at the same time. Their formation moved, and the perfect arc in the air suddenly collapsed. All the blazing wing god envoys flew in 4 directions at the same time, and countless intertwined spirals were drawn in the air. These were from the ancient times. The divine weapons whistled as they swooped down towards everyone in the hall. The first to bear the brunt was naturally Mephisto, who was in the uppermost airspace of the hall. 7 blazing wings targeted him, but the Ash Sword Saint, who had stepped into the ultimate realm, did not care about these artificial creations, because even the Hazel people, who were masters of magical technology on the continent of Wond, designed the most sophisticated golems. Compared to the Annihilation machines, they were at most at the level of elemental activation. The Hazel people could use their numbers to defeat the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but 7 elemental activated constructs were nothing more than flies to the Ash Sword Saint at this time. He calmly raised his head, and the 7 blazing wings came into view. From this moment on, with him as the center, everything within a 360-degree angle was under his attack range. He raised his sword and the sword stood straight. Between the blade and him, and between the blade and the blazing wings, it was as if 2 worlds were separated. One was still, the other was moving. The Ash Sword Saint remained motionless, and then gently slashed at one of the blazing wings with his sword. Crash. It was like the sound of metal shattering. The blazing wing oracle disintegrated in mid-air without any warning. In fact, it was not entirely correct to say that there was no warning because as long as one had a little eyesight, one could see that a thin gray line first appeared on the armor of the construct, and then along that thin line, a thin gray line appeared. It first split into 2, then broke again, then into 4, then into 8, until it shattered into a pile of gray smoke and dissipated in mid-air. Even Brendel could not help but exclaim in admiration when he saw this scene. The most famous fantasy swordsmanship in the Amber Sword. Each of them had a mesmerizing beauty when displayed. It was a pity that this swordsmanship required the ash element as a foundation, and he couldn't learn it even if he wanted to. At this time Mephisto slashed at the second blazing wing god emissary, but this time he miscalculated. The construct holding the 2-handed greatsword suddenly paused in midair, then rolled horizontally. A gray ripple cut along its left arm and shoulder armor, starting from the shoulder blade. This blazing construct was very fast. It was a blazing construct. Suddenly, a blazing construct appeared. The entire left half of the blazing wing's body turned into dust with a bang, and even the double-headed greatsword couldn't be held firmly, falling into the abyss. Mephisto was also slightly surprised. But this was the characteristic of divine creatures. Creatures of the same kind would share memories and experience. They often grew rapidly on the battlefield, and sometimes even became more terrifying skilled fighters than players. Brando didn't intend to remind Mephisto, after all. He was his teacher, not to mention 7 blazing wings against him. It shouldn't be a problem for Mephisto to deal with them, and the key was that he had already seen the other 7 blazing wings flying towards Veronica at the same time, and on the other side, a total of 12 blazing wings were flying towards him. Dark Ko-Hua's hatred for him was evident. Brando could only shake his head and smile bitterly. "Teacher, be careful." Above his head, the little prince couldn't help but remind him loudly. He saw that there were as many as 12 blazing wings surrounding Brando from all directions. He was so nervous that he could hardly breathe. His hands clasped the scabbard of the lion's fang, and his little face was pale. Lenoret also looked in that direction. He thought for a moment and raised the white longbow in his hand. This bow was called Tranquility's Distance, and it was also a famous fantasy weapon collected by the crew's royal family. The eldest prince drew the bow. There were no arrows on the bowstring, but the air automatically gathered to form a bunch of arrows in his hand. In the shape of an arrow, he aimed in the direction where Brando was, ready to lure 1 or 2 constructs over to deal with him. But Ko-Hua seemed to be able to see through the minds of everyone present. Before he released the bowstring, the entrance of the cave darkened slightly, and a blazing wing ambassador had appeared in front of him. That thing made a soft sound similar to a buzzing sound, and directly raised the greatsword in both hands to stab them. Shido was so frightened that she covered her head with both hands, and Lenoret didn't even think about it. He narrowed his eyes and released the bowstring, and an arrow pierced the dark face of the blazing wing ambassador under his helmet. On the battlefield around the platform, 3 blazing wing ambassadors found the Shire, and 2 blocked the way of Hipamera. A chaotic battle was slowly unfolding. Brando looked at the 12 blazing wing ambassadors swooping towards him from all directions, and he was a little nervous. He didn't know how long it had been since he fought with these things. He had fought with them before, but the blazing wing ambassadors of this era couldn't be compared to the ones of that era. He was also a little excited. The blood of the warrior seemed to be burning in his bones. "Come on." Brando showed his snow-white teeth, like a beast choosing a person to devour. The first blazing wing ambassador arrived in a flash. It stretched out the blade of its double-ended sword horizontally, and made up its mind to sweep past Brando with the speed of its dive. But in its spherical vision, its target suddenly disappeared. The reaction of the blazing wing ambassador was not slow, although it continued to move forward under the influence of inertia. But it had already turned around in mid-air, and the double-ended sword in its hand slashed backward. Unfortunately, it only hit the air. Red light flashed under its helmet, and it seemed to raise its head in surprise. In its spherical vision, a dark blade came head-on. With a crash like the sound of broken glass, the blade of the Halran Gaia cut along the helmet of the blazing wing ambassador. It went downwards, splitting the head into 2 halves, and a bright magical brilliance burst out. Then it continued downwards, cutting into the body with the spine as the center, splitting it into 2 halves. All the other blazing wing ambassadors saw this scene. Just as Brando fell from the sky and slashed at their kind, the remaining 11 blazing wing ambassadors adjusted their direction and surrounded him with a buzzing sound. At the same time, red light flashed under their helmets, and a blood-red ray suddenly shot out, piercing straight at Brando. 3 of the rays missed, and the remaining 8 rays respectively pierced through Brando's head, chest, thigh and left arm. But unfortunately, these attacks were meaningless. Brando's sword had not yet been pulled out from the body of the first blazing wing ambassador, but at the same time, his figure appeared in the second and the third, behind the 4th blazing wing ambassador. The second blazing wing ambassador did not even have time to react before it was pierced through the heart by the sword and fell into the abyss. The 3rd blazing wing ambassador only had time to turn its head, and Brando stretched out his left hand and pressed down on its helmet. A ball of flame exploded from Bahamut's blessing, and the Blazing Wing ambassador almost trembled from the explosion. Brando took the opportunity. The sword was inserted into its throat, and the hilt of the sword made a half circle along its neck. The unlucky Blazing Wing ambassador's head was immediately separated from its body. Brando casually threw its head out, and it hit another Blazing Wing ambassador not far away, and a crisp sound rang out. The Blazing Wing ambassador was immediately attracted. It raised its huge sword in both hands and swung it in a full circle in midair, then slashed down at Brando. The blade of the sword cut through Brando's shoulder, and the next moment, its figure twisted and disappeared. At this time, Brando had already fought with the fourth Blazing Wing ambassador, but this time the Blazing Wing ambassador dodged his first sneak attack, causing him to slash empty air. Brando stared at the Blazing Wing ambassador's dodging movements with some excitement. These divine creatures had gradually begun to become more powerful. At this time, there were still 20 Blazing Wing ambassadors left on the field. Brando and Mephisto had each killed 3 of the 3 Blazing Wing ambassadors, Veronica had 2, and the Shire had 1. But for the remaining Blazing Wing ambassadors, Brando knew that each of them was more powerful than the previous Blazing Wing ambassadors. However, this was not a problem for Brando. At this time, if the Blazing Wing ambassador had the ability to think, it would have discovered that Brando seemed to know their attack patterns like the back of his hand. The fourth Blazing Wing ambassador turned around to counterattack, but it discovered with a flash of red light that Brando seemed to have expected it to do so. He easily dodged to the side with a mocking expression on his face. It was deeply imprinted in its vision, and at the same time, a palm wrapped in a metal glove appeared on its attack route and grabbed its wrist with a click. Before the Blazing Wing ambassador had time to react, it felt lifted into the air and then crashed heavily into something. Brando directly slammed the 2 Blazing Wing ambassadors together with a shoulder throw, and then with a backhand slash, they were annihilated together. At this time, Mephisto had just killed another Blazing Wing ambassador, which meant that Brando's killing speed at this moment was ahead of everyone present. Lenneret finally defeated their only opponent with the help of Shido's spell. The eldest prince's face was taut, and his chest rose and fell rapidly. Shido looked at the strange machine that stumbled out of the hole, gasping for breath. The notebook she was holding had a deep cut in it. If it wasn't for the thickness of the book, it wouldn't have been so thick. If it were not for the thick notebook, she would probably be lying in a pool of blood at this moment. But compared to that, the scholar would rather lie in a pool of blood. She looked at the notes she had accumulated with great difficulty, and tears were about to fall. But Haruz was more nervous than the 2 of them. He was covered in ice shards and hurriedly got up and ran to the entrance of the cave, as if he was afraid that his teacher would be killed by those monsters. He had seen how powerful those monsters were before. Prince Lenneret, Shido, and he had managed to kill one of them with great difficulty. But now, however, when he looked at the platform below, he was surprised to find that the battle below was very different from what he had imagined. Brando was also injured, but this injury was in exchange for the 3 Blazing Wing ambassadors. His right hand was dripping with blood, and the blood even flowed through the hilt, bypassed the guard, and dripped down along the dark blade of the Halran Gaia. But beside him, the original 12 Blazing Wing ambassadors had long been scattered, leaving only 5 floating shakily in the air. From time to time, attacks were launched from all directions. But at this time, Brando had completely integrated into the memory of the past battle, and the instincts of a player seemed to have returned to him. He was no longer a planeswalker, but a genuine veteran warrior. His attacks were not limited to swordsmanship. Players' attacks had always been about results, not focusing on during this process. Haruz was dumbfounded. He saw that his teacher had completely given up his defense and rushed towards one of the Blazing Wing ambassadors like a meteor. The Blazing Wing ambassador immediately stabbed his teacher with its double-ended sword. The speed of the 2 was so fast that even the little prince almost thought that his teacher was going to be injured. However, Brando seemed to have expected it. He moved slightly to the side and made the opponent's attack completely miss. At the same time, his sword pierced into the opponent's chest without any hindrance, making a crisp sound like a broken gear. At this time, the remaining Blazing Wing emissaries surrounded him, but Haruz saw that his teacher didn't even turn his head. Instead, he threw a backhand punch. This punch was beyond everyone's expectations. It hit the side of the Blazing Wing emissary's helmet, which was the cheek. The force was so great that the blazing wing emissary's head was almost dented. The strange machine flew out, starting from the head and then the body, under the astonished gaze of the little prince. This punch must have hurt a lot. He could not help but squint because he saw that the head of the strange machine was so twisted that even the parts and gears inside seemed to have flown out. Haruz also knew swordsmanship. He estimated the reaction of the strange machine and thought that it was not that the other party was not prepared, but it was guarding against the sword in Brando's hand. It never dreamed that it would be punched by this human. Teacher, really? Haruz swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Although Brando taught him swordsmanship, he had never seen his teacher fly into a rage. He heard from his sister that the Count seemed to be a brilliant summoner, but he had never thought that his swordsmanship would be like this. The king of Erewhon lay at the entrance of the cave in a daze. For a moment he felt that he could not accept it, but for a moment he felt his blood boil. This was the battle in his mind. Chapter 832. The Count's swordsmanship is really. Shido was also in disbelief. I have never seen such swordsmanship. Efficient and practical. Lenoret breathed a sigh of relief. He also had several injuries on his body, but the prince of the cruise people did not show any pretense at all. Instead, he looked more like a qualified warrior. He said with a straight face, although it is a little too vulgar and has no aristocratic bearing, this kind of swordsmanship is simply born to defeat the opponent. Shido muttered to herself. Swordsmanship is originally a killing technique, and the sword is a weapon for killing. The young prince did not say a word, but he suddenly remembered what his sister had told him. Your teacher's swordsmanship is not even a killing swordsmanship born on the battlefield, but a swordsmanship on how to end a battle cleanly. So it's natural and smooth without any sloppiness. I'm also very curious about what kind of environment can create such a swordsmanship. This was the way players fought. They did not seek to finish the job in one blow, but once they seized the opportunity, they would pursue an attack with the greatest burst of power. It did not matter even if they suffered a little injury. Veronica was also paying attention to the battlefield. She originally thought that Brando would be in a difficult battle, and made up her mind to support him as soon as he could not hold on. But what she did not expect was that Brando not only did not fall into a difficult battle, but also gained the upper hand. Her cyan eyes flashed with a trace of incredulity. In her eyes, Brando shuttled between the pipes of different heights, using the terrain to deal with those weird machines, and always launched attacks in incredible ways. The blazing wing oracle was either stabbed in the back, colliding with his own people, or simply kicked to the wall by Brando. With electric arcs and sparks, they fell into the abyss below one by one. This was not because of any swordsmanship at all. This was experience. The female Legion commander was full of surprise because she understood that it was not Erewhon's military swordsmanship, and it had nothing to do with the White Raven swordsmanship, nor was it the swordsmanship similar to flash strike sword art mentioned in the intelligence. It was just combat experience. For a moment she was in a trance. How could such a person exist? Brando was only 20 years old. She knew very well that the intelligence gathered from various sources proved that the other party was not lying. But for a 20-year-old young man, where did his terrifying combat experience come from? Sometimes she couldn't even understand how he could kill the enemy like that. This could only mean one thing. Her knowledge couldn't keep up with Brando's thinking. This was simply absurd, which meant that the young man's combat experience might even surpass hers. Logic told her that it was right, but experience told her that it was impossible. Veronica was very conflicted. She was also a sacred swordsman and a famous one at that. She was the commander of the Cruz Empire's azure firmament. She had fought against the Hazel people, the monsters, and the pagans. Looking at her life, it seemed that half of her 50 years of life was spent in battle. She was too proud to admit it. This was no longer a matter of talent. Veronica racked her brains, but she couldn't figure out why this happened. She couldn't help but raise her head and look at Mephisto, who was not far away. The Ash Sacred Swordsman's eyes were also filled with inexplicable surprise. However, Mephisto was surprised, but she was a little regretful. You took in a good student, Mephisto. Veronica was very jealous. If she knew this would happen, she would have pulled Brando to her side at the loop of trade winds. Now she regretted it. Who cared about the Cruz people and Erewhon people? As long as Brando became her student, he would definitely side with Cruz. After all, Erwin was too young to be a threat to Cruz. Why didn't she think of this in the beginning? At the same time, Ko Hua in the dark was also full of anxiety. She originally wanted to get rid of the weakest among Veronica, Mephisto, and Brando, but she never dreamed that Brando would give her such a big surprise. You hid your strength. In her opinion, this was the only reason. It was impossible for a young man in his 20s to have such terrifying combat experience. She saw the shadows of those who had fought with her in the past in Brando. Although he was not as terrifying as the Dark Dragon Odin, the Dragon of Fury, or the Crystal, he was almost as powerful as the demigods in the Twilight War. In human terms, he was a demigod. She thought about it, and there was only one possibility. It could be that her old opponents from the ancient times, disguised as humans, came to find trouble with her. This idea was easy to understand. Since she could recover, why couldn't others? The gods were far away, but there were still many powerful existences who were not gods. The most famous of them were probably the Dark Dragon Odin and the Azure Knight. Thinking of this, Ko Hua's face changed. Her bright hair fluttered in the wind and she screamed angrily, "You are definitely not an iron person. You are a divine person. Who are you?" Divine person? Brando finally woke up from Ko Hua's roar. He had already finished off all his opponents and helped Hippamera out. The cleric girl was almost in a desperate situation in the previous battle. Her combat level was not as good as the Shire's, and the siege of the three blazing wings almost made her breathless. She had several wounds on her body, and her robe was torn. It was not easy for her to catch her breath. She took a deep breath and thanked Brando from a distance. "Thank you, Sir Lord." Brando looked at his battered and exhausted subordinates and was a little annoyed. However, Ko Hua's words still attracted his attention. What was a divine person? Was Odin a divine person? Was the Azure Knight a divine person? Odin had once told him that they did have some noble blood flowing in their bodies. Brando could guess that they might be descendants of a divine person, but they were not pure-blooded divine person. He had always been curious about the relationship between the divine person and the gods. In a literal sense, the divine person seemed to be the people of the gods. There was a mainstream school of thought in Wonde that believed that the divine person was the first generation of inhabitants of Wonde. They were the servants of the gods, and then there was the golden generation and the silver generation. But from the description of the Pale poem, the divine person should at least be on an equal footing with Martha or the gods, because the first paragraph of the Pale poem wrote that the divine person and Martha weave this world together. And now, Ko Hua's words had a different meaning. She must know that the gods would not walk the earth anymore. She also said that she was the only awakened god in Wonde, but she berated him for not being an iron person, but a divine person. Although it sounded like a slip of the tongue in a fit of anger, Brendel keenly grasped the flaw in it, and Corfa must have understood it. A divine person was not a god. Then what was a divine person? Brando actually had a suspicion for a long time. A divine person was very likely a planeswalker, the legendary manager. If that was the case, then everything barely made sense. There was only one doubt left. Why did Odin and the Azure Knight only call themselves descendants of the divine person, and not directly call themselves divine person? After all, they were genuine planeswalkers. Was it modesty? Or was there something else they were hiding? And Brando faintly felt that his strange system might have some kind of connection with this puzzle. He simply raised his head and smiled mockingly at Ko Hua. "Ko Hua, this has nothing to do with the divine person. It's just that the junk you released is too weak. If you want to talk about divine person, aren't there a few here?" He looked at Mephisto and Veronica meaningfully. The two of them had just disposed of all the blazing wing messengers, and even the Shire had dismantled the two blazing wing messengers that were fighting against him. Although the Shire's strength was at the same level as Hippamera's, his combat experience was far from what the latter could compare to. "Don't play dumb." Corfa was fooled as expected and replied coldly, "I'm not talking about your mediocre strength but your combat instincts. Don't you think you're being a little too pretentious? An elemental activated insect with the combat instincts of a commander level." Commander-level combat instincts. Brando caught another term. He knew very well where his combat instincts came from. It was the experience of a level 130 warrior. The growth rate of a player's ability was far faster than that of an NPC. A level 130 warrior was almost equivalent to a few hundred years of combat experience for the NPCs, or even more. He knew very well that the pure combat ability of his era had probably surpassed that of William of this era. In other words, he was indeed close to the divine realm, but there was still a long way to go before he had the power to exist. Can commander-level combat instincts prove that I'm a divine person? Brando deliberately smiled contemptuously. Of course not, but are you a divine person? Are you Alphonse, Crystal, or Blazing? Ko Hua's sneer echoed throughout the space. She felt that she had completely seen through Brando's disguise. At the same time, she gritted her teeth in hatred. No wonder this guy saw through her weakness at a glance. She did not believe that the Iron Person of this era had knowledge and memories about the ancient era, about the gods. Even the Silver Person could not. Brando finally understood. In other words, in Ko Hua's view, a commander-level strength was either a divine person or a divine person. There was no other possibility. He also remembered that Ko Hua was also a commander-level monster in the Dust Camp, and the commander-level existence that she spoke of was likely to be an existence corresponding to them on the side of Order, which was an opponent of the same level as her. Brando estimated that according to Cruz's mythological classification, it was about the strength of a demigod or above. Brando suddenly began to feel that it was interesting. It was the first time that he was so close to the inside story of the chaotic era in the game. He knew very well that the story, quests, and rewards of the game story about that era were mostly outrageous. Because no matter if it was an item or a skill, as long as it was labeled with the prefix ancient, it was a symbol of extreme awesomeness. Just like Flash Strike sword art and 9 Luminaries sword art, these things were products of recent ancient times. And with the Battle of Babel Fortress as a dividing line, the history before that was called Before the Era, which referred to the myths and legends before the chaotic era. And in the game there was only one kind of item that players came into contact with before the era: the War Slate. But just this was enough to drive everyone crazy. Where are you from? Ko Hua suddenly asked. 11, 12, or 17? What did these numbers mean? Brando was a little confused, but he did not show it on his face and pretended that he had been exposed. He smiled bitterly and said, "No comment." But he did not expect that dark Ko Hua, who had almost completely turned into lightning, suddenly quieted down and stared coldly at him with his silver-white eyes. "Strange, you are not a celestial. What are you? You are the F***king thing." Brando cursed, but he did not expect that the other party's attitude would change 180 degrees. Thinking back, the problem could only be with that set of numbers. But no matter how hard he racked his brain, he couldn't figure out what the connection was, and Corfa certainly wouldn't answer his similar questions again. At this time, Veronica and Mephisto finally came to his side. "Brendel, what are you playing at?" Veronica was the first to ask. But Brendel felt that the way she looked at him was a little strange. It was like a little girl who wanted a toy but could not get it. He could not help but feel a chill down his spine. What kind of strange idea is she up to again? He hurriedly replied, "Yes. I don't know what she is talking about, Lady Veronica. I just wanted to get some information out of her." "You're following her words." Veronica realized what was going on. Brando nodded. Their conversation was naturally seen by Ko Hua. Although the eldest daughter of Ekis had expected it, she was still furious. With her status and knowledge, she was fooled by an iron folk. Of course, she didn't know that Brendel's experience was more eccentric, and his knowledge might not be as good as hers. But in Corfa's eyes at this moment, Brendel was just a bug, and now the truth was in front of her eyes. She was deceived by a bug. And it was in front of her sister. If she still had a physical body, her face would have turned red and white. Her embarrassment and anger finally turned into a thunderous roar. "You will pay the price, mortals." It was as if the entire space trembled. Everyone present turned around and found that dark Ko Hua was bathed in a snow-white brilliance. Hundreds and thousands of lightning bolts as thick as an arm interweaved from all directions and merged into her body. Seeing this, Brando was the first to react. "Divine barrier. The divine barrier has disappeared. That guy is going to fight personally." Sure enough, in the next moment, an invisible barrier shattered like glass around Ko Hua. Before it shattered, one could barely see that it was a complete sphere. Then, in the blink of an eye, it dissipated into the air. In an instant, lightning gathered on Ko-Hwa's body, forming a bright electric ball. Korfa, on the other hand, was like a butterfly in a cocoon, completely wrapped in this electric ball. Her body had become vaguely visible, but her eyes had become 1,000 times brighter. Divine power sublimation. Shido, who watched this scene unfold, could not help but mutter to herself, "Divine power sublimation. This is divine power sublimation. What's that?" Haruz turned around and asked, puzzled. But Miss Scholar was obviously stunned, and did not hear his question at all. Korfa, who was behind him, smiled at the little prince, her eyes reflecting the bright brilliance of the lightning below, and replied, "According to your words, it is to ignite the divine fire." The originally weak flame called divine power was ignited. At first it was just a flame, but it gradually became a raging flame. Milo's remaining divine power was like a seed. But at this moment, this seed had taken root and sprouted in Ko-Hwa's body. Even Brando could feel an irresistible aura being born in the entire space, causing everything in this space to groan and scream in turmoil. There seemed to be visible ripples in the air, and some indescribable things were gathering from all directions, merging into the electric ball where Ko-Hwa was. Ko-Hwa's dark soul was resonating with the entire holy cathedral of the hibernator. No, Milos's body. Brando suddenly understood what those things that merged into the electric ball were. It was order, law, the power of the domain. That was Milos's divine title. His face changed and he hurriedly shouted to the others, "Be careful, she and Milos are even closer together." So this is the power of order. Ko-Hwa's voice changed. The arrogant, conceited, and cold voice from before seemed to have disappeared, leaving only this thunder-like, majestic, queen-like voice. Brando could already tell that this voice was very close to Milo's voice, but this was a woman's voice. Order and chaos intertwine and coexist, like light and shadow, and are not meaningless. Ko-Hwa raised her arm in the electric cocoon. However, these things that are eternal and unchanging do not belong to you mortals. Let me clear the obstacles for Milos and rebuild this world. She proudly raised her chin and spread her 5 fingers. Accept your judgment. Hundreds of blazing white lightning beams rose from behind Ko-Hwa in front of Brando and the other shocked eyes, like a white peacock spreading its tail. But after those beams formed a huge fan and separated, they suddenly turned in midair and stabbed at everyone in the hall. Chapter 833. The sky was filled with crisscrossing blazing white rays of light. It was like a rain of light, hitting the platform, the blazing magic power transmission pipes, or passing by Brando, Veronica, and Mephistopheles, or hitting the magic shield that the Shire General was about to open, stirring up layers of violent vibrating ripples on it. Hippamera dodged to the edge of the platform with difficulty, but a beam of light still shattered the sacrificial staff in her hand in front of her astonished gaze. Others shot in the direction of Cruz's eldest son, turning the ice cave into a honeycomb. Large and small pieces of ice fell from the sky, smashing into Shido and Haruz, who were holding their heads and screaming. The first layer of light had not yet faded, and the second layer of light was generated along the path of the previous layer of light. They were like lines drawn with milky white paint on a dark canvas, scattering in the center of the platform like countless snakes, scattering towards everyone present. "Brendel, that's the Hunter siblings." Veronica suddenly realized what was going on. Brando was startled, and then his expression changed drastically. They had been entangled with Ko-Hwa and her minions before, and the battle had nothing to do with Peya and Yuruta. But this time, Ko-Hwa launched an indiscriminate attack, and the Hunter siblings themselves were only a little stronger than ordinary people, not to mention that they were still unconscious. If they were hit, it would be a disaster. But the problem was that no one had thought of this problem before, and now each of them was a considerable distance away from the Hunter siblings. And the white lightning was already in front of them. Brando was full of regret and could only watch the tragedy unfold in front of him. He still remembered that he had promised Peya to protect her and her brother, and the words were still in his ears. But the first beam of light hit a place very close to Peya, melting into a bright red on the platform, and the second beam adjusted its direction and stabbed straight at the Hunter girl's chest. It was at this time that a holy light shield unexpected by everyone fell from the sky, enveloping the Hunter siblings in it, and blocking the attack for them. She was Hippamera, the only one present who could use divine spells. Brando reacted, but he had a bad feeling in his heart. He looked back and saw that the priestess girl had thrown away her shattered staff. She didn't even care about herself and first opened a shield for Peya and Yuruta, who were lying on the platform. Protect yourself. Be careful. Brando knew the price Hipamera would have to pay. A beam of light pierced through her left arm, and Hipamera screamed in pain. Her body swayed slightly, and then a beam of light pierced through her lower abdomen. Woo! The young girl bit her lips and let out a low cry. Blood spurted out like a fountain, and she rolled on the platform covered in blood. Hipamera! Brando was furious, but another beam of light swept toward him. He had no choice but to turn around and hide under a row of magic power transmission pipes, letting dozens of light beams hit it and create sparks. The county. Brando went around to the bottom of the pipe, untied a bottle from his belt, and threw it to his wizard attendant not far away. Pass it over. The county hurriedly turned the shield in another direction, but the light beams still hit it with a buzzing sound, rolling up layers of waves on the cyan light shield. He caught the bottle, weighed it, and immediately guessed that it should be holy water number 13. Veronica was waving her sword like a mirror, deflecting the light one by one, but when she looked up, her cyan eyes had already reflected the third wave of crisscrossing white lines rising behind Ko Hua. At this time the entire space was filled with incandescent lightning. Little one Mephistopheles, we have to think of something. We can't let her attack as she pleases. She also felt troubled. My lord, I'm also having some trouble here. The county was also full of anxiety, but the light beams shooting at them were like torrential rain, making it impossible for him to move his feet. Of course this could not go on. Ko Hua had Milos as an endless source of energy, and they would be exhausted to death. Brando pondered for a moment, then raised his head and shouted to his teacher above him. Teacher, can you think of a way to attack Ko Hua, so that she can't concentrate on attacking us? Among the 5 of them, only Mephistopheles had the strength to launch a counterattack. Mephistopheles immediately rushed towards Ko Hua. For a moment countless white light beams flew towards him, but every white line that came to the Ash Sword Saint's side was reflected by a gray reflective surface that appeared out of nowhere. The denser the white lines were, the more frequent the reflections were. The Ash Realm surrounded Mephistopheles, and for a moment, it was like a sparkling wave of light. The Ash Sword Saint seemed to have forcibly torn a crack in the white lightning and explosions, which made Ko Hua jump in fright. Damn it, damn it! She screamed angrily, and hurriedly redirected most of her attacks towards Mephistopheles. In this way, the pressure on Brando and Veronica was greatly reduced. But the price was that Mephistopheles had to temporarily retreat, and his power of order was greatly depleted. At this time, the county finally had the time to raise his shield and rush towards Hipamera. The white light beams were like tracers hitting his shield. On the platform there were even stray bullets that hit Hipamera, who was trying to get up again. The girl's shoulder exploded into a blob of blood, and with a cry she lay completely in a pool of blood. The county rushed over to drag the county back, but no matter how hard he tried, he was always a hair's breadth away. Ko Hua seemed to have seen through their intentions, and mobilized a relatively high density of attacks to stop the county's next move. The shield in the county's hand was flickering, and the magic power consumption was astonishing. Gradually, sweat appeared on his forehead. If this continued, he would have to retreat to the bottom of the pipe. Of course, Brando saw the predicament, and could not help but be anxious. At this time he could not care less, and at this time he shouted, "The county, quickly raise your shield and face me." The county was slightly stunned. Quickly. Brando was very anxious. My lord, you can't take the risk. Hipamera's intermittent voice suddenly came from the soul, and she seemed to be enduring great pain as she whispered, I haven't been following you for long, give up on me. What do you mean by long? Do you think I'm a merchant? Brando stared at the county. Quickly, this is an order. The county smiled bitterly and did not face Brando with the shield. Instead, he extended the edge of the shield for a while, and now it could also cover the direction Brando was facing. That's more like it. Brendel heaved a sigh of relief. Charles replied, but don't just focus on saving the damsel in distress and get me into trouble, my lord. Nonsense, don't you want to save her? The county shrugged. I'll cover you. My lord. Mr. the County. Hipamra was lying in a pool of blood and murmured. Brando naturally did not stop for a moment. He directly launched Flash Strike Sword Art and slashed at the County. Buzz! With a soft sound, the County's shield flashed more violently than ever before. He could not help but cry out in shock. My lord, do you want to kill me? Shut up. Brando of course knew that his troublesome attendant was joking with him, but he was not in the mood now. He withdrew his sword from the County's shield, and in a flash, he had already arrived beside Hipamra. The cleric girl was so miserable that he could hardly bear to look at her. There was not a spot on her body that was not stained with blood. Brando secretly hated Ko Hua's heavy-handed attack. At the same time he hugged Hipamra's soft body. At this time a white light swept towards him. He had to carry Hipamra and roll to the edge of the platform. He looked down from the edge and was pleasantly surprised to find that there were a few pipes that could hide people. Brando hurriedly jumped down from there, and then put Hipamra on top of the pipe. He carefully lifted her head, but he was immediately stunned because he saw Hipamra's blood-stained face. The girl's eyes were closed, her face was pale, and her dry lips were trembling slightly. She seemed to be very scared. Only then did he understand how much courage it took for her to say those words. His heart softened, and he patted her back to reassure her. Then, he took out a bottle of number 13 holy water, and let her open her mouth, and then he fed her little by little. After a while Hipamra's eyelashes moved and she opened her eyes, but there was only guilt in her sea-blue eyes. I'm sorry, my lord, Enough, you've done well enough. Brando replied. In any case, for a girl who was only at the beginning of Gold Tier and had not been on the battlefield, her performance could be said to be perfect. And the key was courage. Brando knew that Hipamra's courage came from her loyalty to him. He also did not know why this girl's loyalty to him seemed to be more devout than the others. It was like a believer's obedience to her god. He could only think that it might be a problem with the card and character settings, but even so, it was enough to move him. Have a good rest and leave the rest to us. Hipamra's face was full of unwillingness, and she bit her lip. Although Brando said to leave the rest to us, in fact he was not confident. Ko Hua's attack at this stage was a bit ridiculous. Even Mephisto could not block it. His strength was second only to the sage. He gently put Hipamra down again and then looked up. The space was intertwined with electric arcs and explosions. Ko Hua was at the center of the entire platform, easily manipulating countless white lines to attack everyone. Suddenly there was a scream above his head. Brando heard Haru's voice and his heart tightened. He knew that there was no time to delay. He must pose a threat to Ko Hua's body. I can only take the risk. Brando patted the edge of Haoran Gaia. In the intertwining white light, dark Ko Hua felt the energy in her body increasing exponentially. She could not help but squint her eyes. There was an illusion in her heart. As long as she waved her hand, everything in front of her could be turned into ashes. This feeling of being in control of everything was too good. Even in her heyday before the new era, she had never experienced such a wonderful pleasure. So this was the feeling of being a god in the world of order. She licked her lips and began to like this feeling a little. Although there were only some insects in front of her, but controlling lightning for her own use, and using this power of nature to destroy everything, it felt good. She was still at ease, but the people in front of her were already struggling. At this moment the images appeared once again around her. Perkins had already turned into a sea of flames, and the next city was 10-Armed City. A virtual hourglass was currently counting down in the sky above the city. The next time the hourglass was filled with energy, it would be the end of the city. Destruction to dark Ko Hua was a kind of pleasure. She could not help but laugh out loud. Like the shrill laughter of a demon, it echoed in the space. Mephisto and Veronica were both livid. But no one noticed that it was at this time below the platform that Brando had already disappeared. Haruz leaned against the ice wall with a pale face, as if he was very cold and shivered. Miss Scholar was so anxious that she was about to cry. She had covered the little prince with all the spare clothes in her backpack, but the latter's body temperature was still dropping rapidly. There was a large pool of blood behind him, and blood was still gushing out of his chest. Am I going to die? No, absolutely not. By the way, Haruz, do you look like your sister? Shido, under Lenorette's signal, kept diverting the little prince's attention so that he could stay awake. Haruz shook his head weakly. Really? Shido was a little skeptical. I don't believe she is more beautiful than you. Haruz wanted to cry, but he could not. He was a man. Miss Shido, I'm a little not happy at all when you say that. Who are you? At this time, the voices of Lorena and her husband, who had been guarding outside the cave, came in. Of course, it was mainly Philas's shouting voice. Then there was a muffled groan and the sound of fighting. The eldest prince immediately frowned and looked in that direction. Soon they saw Lorena supporting the injured Philas back. Shido looked up and her face changed immediately. She saw a group of black-robed knights pouring in from the outside. All for one. Her vision was sometimes clear and sometimes blurry. Scarlet suddenly remembered an experience of encountering a pack of wolves in the mountains, which seemed to be the scene in front of her. However, in the dark mountains, the bright moon was in the sky, and the howls of wolves rose and fell one after another. The wolves were like shadows in the forest, one after another, appearing all around. Wolves were cunning and cruel when they moved in groups, just like the crew's nobles who were approaching in shadows. They seemed to be winking at each other, like a pack of wolves trying to outflank the jungle, growling and baring their white fangs. Scarlet shook her head in a daze, and in a trance, she realized that it was the gleaming longsword in the hands of the noble soldiers. The crew's people were surrounding her again. Scarlet barely kept her eyelids half open. She saw the young man with a crossbow not far away seem to be persuading her, but his voice was humming far and near at the same time, and she could not hear him clearly, and the other party's expression seemed to be exaggerated without limit. He sometimes smiled, revealing rows of neat teeth which made her shudder. Just like that, a long while passed. She saw a man coming towards her, close to her. She gritted her teeth and stepped back, only to find that she was powerless to resist. My lord! Scarlet's heart was in distress. She suddenly felt afraid that she would never see her lord again. She was so scared that she almost trembled. Her face was covered with a layer of gray, and tears flowed down her face uncontrollably. At this time, a cold blade was placed on her neck, and then she felt a sharp pain on her scalp. Someone grabbed her hair and pulled her head up. She had no choice but to look at the person. Her vision was very dim, as if she was in a daze. She could barely see that there was a long scar on the person's face, and he was looking at her with a somewhat playful gaze. A female monkey in the forest. Hey, what do you mean by that look? In her daze, the other party laughed and said. Scarlet seemed to be stung, and she struggled with all her might. The man shouted angrily, grabbed her head, and slammed her against the ice wall behind her. The mountain maiden felt her vision go dark, and she coughed heavily. Then she heard a series of scolding. The young man seemed to be loudly reprimanding his companions, but Scarlet did not feel any sense of security. She just wanted to curl up and provide herself with a sense of protection. But the man pulled her hair and turned her face, and then patted her face with his hand, as if he was saying something to her. Something about Veronica, the Pahiru family, conspiracy, treason, Her Majesty the Empress, and so on. In between, he seemed to mention the Lord's name. Scarlet trembled and tried hard to hear what the other party was saying, but the voice seemed to be getting weaker, as if it came from the horizon. She felt her eyelids getting heavier, and waves of sleepiness came over her. After the man finished asking, he stopped and looked at her, but she was a little confused. Then there was a heavy slap to the face, and she felt that half of her face was numb and swollen. She could not open her eyes and could only squint slightly, but she still gritted her teeth and stared at those people. At that moment, as if she was enlightened, Scarlet understood that the other party's target was not her. They wanted to deal with the Lord and Lady Veronica. This was like a conviction that was injected into Scarlet's heart, and made her sober a little. In her vision that had become abnormally narrow, she saw the young man called Babarn pull away the person who was interrogating her, and then the two of them had a fierce argument. No, I must inform the Lord. This was the only thought in the mountain maiden's mind in a daze. But at this time, a voice seemed to have drilled into the depths of her heart. Scarlet, I remember that is your name, right? Oh. Chapter 834. The Black Knight creaked as he walked on the ice and filed in. Lorena, Faraz, Lenarette, and Shido raised their hands one by one, each with a black crystal-like longsword resting on their necks. The sword-wielding Black Knight had a long black velvet cloak and an expressionless face, like a golem made by a wizard. The ice cave was a mess, and the crisscrossing sword marks on the ice proved the fierce battle that had taken place before. The Black Knight dragged the bodies of 2 of their people out, leaving a dark red mark on the ice. One of the particularly tall Black Knight came to Ko Hua, and the girl looked back with her pale silver eyes without fear, but she could only see a pair of particularly bright eyes under the shadow of the other party's hood, as well as the thin lower half of his cheeks. The Black Knight stared at Ko Hua's snow-white neck for a while, as if considering whether to put his sword there. "Please step aside," Ko Hua said in a crisp voice. "Miss Ko Hua." The knight put his hand on his chest and bowed slightly to Ko Hua, the heavy armor rubbing against the chainmail below making a clattering sound of metal colliding. "Are you going to do to me what you did to them?" Ko Hua glanced at Shido, who was biting her lower lip in fear, and asked calmly. "I wouldn't dare." The knight replied with his head lowered. Ko Hua smiled slightly. She knew that these people were believers of the dusk, and they respected her mostly because of her sister. Perhaps they thought that was Ekis' eldest daughter, the leader of the monsters of the Dusk Legion. If mortals worshipped gods and Martha, then these people's fanatical idols included Darkness Ko Hua. Although she was simple-minded, she couldn't help but sigh in her heart, understanding that they just wanted to believe the truth that they were willing to believe. "Then I beg you to let them go, okay?" she asked softly. "I'm afraid not." "Aren't you guys afraid that I'll get angry? I'll tell my sister." Ko Hua's face hardened. "Ko Hua-sama won't blame us for this. These people," he turned around to look, "are all your enemies. I will not fight with anyone. They are not my enemies. At least it belongs to your sister, right, our little princess?" The knight's lips curled up. Ko Hua shut her mouth. She glanced at the trembling Shido and said, "Then at least let her go. She's just a child, she's no threat to you." The knight turned around and nodded. The Black Knight beside Shido sheathed his sword, and the scholar slowly slid to the ground as if paralyzed. She then burst into tears. The knight frowned and glanced outside. However, the battle outside was still going on fiercely, and no one was paying attention to the noise here. He breathed a sigh of relief, then turned back to Ko Hua and said, "Please stay here, Miss Ko Hua." Ko Hua glanced at him, neither answering yes nor no. She just stepped back and sat down. She looked at the crying Shido and gave her a comforting look. The latter looked at her gratefully, and her sobs gradually subsided. The knight nodded with satisfaction. He raised his right hand and gestured to his colleagues. A small team of Black Knights with longbows came up from behind. They passed by the knight's position and cautiously approached the entrance of the cave. Haruz watched this scene in a daze. When he saw the Black Knight approaching the entrance of the cave, he suddenly realized what they were going to do. He suddenly panicked and opened his mouth, pretending to shout. But before he could do that, 2 feet suddenly appeared in front of him. He raised his head and saw the knight looking down at him. "If I were you, Your Highness, I would keep my mouth shut." "What is he doing?" The little female dragon and Medisha lay side by side under an ice crevice. Not far from them, Arek was limping towards an exit in front. He seemed to be seriously injured, and every time he dragged his feet for a while, he had to stop to rest. He now looked more like a beggar than a duke. His fluffy silver-gray hair was messy, the wrinkles on his forehead were tightly knitted together. His face was gray, oily, and sweaty. His chest rose and fell rapidly like a broken bellows. He rested for a while, then struggled to get up with the wall and continued to walk forward. But he didn't go far before he fell on the slippery and cold ground. He struggled to crawl for a distance, then stopped again. This time, Alaz and Medisha watched him stop for a long time, at least a quarter of an hour, before he sat up dejectedly. After a moment of silence, he stood up shakily and continued to walk in the direction of the exit. "He seems to be going somewhere." "Where?" "I don't know." "He seems to know the way here." Alaz and Medisa looked at each other and nodded. Then, they climbed up from the bottom of the ice crevice and sneakily followed him. Arek did not notice that he was being followed. After he walked out of the exit, he continued to move in a certain direction along the winding paths and corridors. He seemed to be familiar with this place. Every time he encountered a fork in the road, he only hesitated for a moment, and then chose the direction. Medisha used to be the commander of the Silver Elves and had a strong sense of direction. After a few times she judged that Arek should be heading north. Not long after, the traces of man-made buildings in front of Arek disappeared. What appeared in front of Arek was a naturally formed glacier crack. Alaz and Medisha saw him resting for a moment at the entrance of the glacier. He took out something from under his clothes and took 2 bites, chewing with difficulty. Alaz's eyes were sharp and saw that it was probably a piece of jerky. "He's replenishing his strength," she said with some excitement. "This means that we should be reaching the destination soon. He didn't do this before. Why is he replenishing his strength?" Medisha was a little puzzled. "Who knows?" Alaz was as carefree as ever. "Let's follow him and find out. Should we restrain him first?" Medisha thought for a moment and felt a little uneasy. "No." Alaz shook her head. "What if we're not there yet? This guy is very stubborn. He definitely won't lead the way for us." The Silver Elf Princess thought about it and agreed, so she nodded. Just as the two were talking, the Duke had already wolfed down the food in his hand. He took out a handful of snow-white powder from his pocket and held it in his hand for a moment. Then he frowned and swallowed it with difficulty. Alaz and Medisha both saw clearly that it was snow. Arek must have preserved it in the ice crevice earlier. Fortunately, the temperature of the ice layer did not melt it. But this further confirmed Alaz's guess. After drinking the snow water, Arek coughed twice at the top of his voice, obviously a little unbearable. But he still stood up slowly and without much hesitation, walked directly into the glacier step by step. Seeing this scene, Alaz was excited again. She hurriedly waved at Medisha and the 2 girls followed behind her. The glacier was very long and narrow, with a faint blue light. After walking for a short while, Alaz suddenly turned around and patted Medisha on the shoulder. "Medisha, do you hear something?" In the dark environment, her golden eyes were particularly bright and sparkling. Medisha glanced at her and nodded. Thanks to her long pointed ears, the elf's hearing was very outstanding. She had already heard the sound from the other side of the glacier. "It's lightning. That means we're in the right place," Alaz replied with a little excitement. "He must have some tricks up his sleeve, but Lady Martha is obviously on our side. He's dead meat." Medisha's expression was a little strange. She looked at Alaz and showed some anxiety. "Anyway, let's go quickly. Sister Alaz, I'm worried that we'll be late." "What's wrong? What are you worried about?" I think I heard the voice of the Lord." "What?" The exit on the other side of the glacier was located on top of the cliff. Outside the exit, there was a deep gorge about 20 to 30 meters long. At this moment outside the gorge, lightning seemed to have weaved into a terrifying storm, wreaking havoc in the entire gorge. And because of the gorge, it was difficult to see the exit in this direction from the platform where Ko Hua was in the dark. On the contrary, standing at the exit, Arek could see the situation below. His pale, skeleton-like claws were clasped tightly on the ice. With a cold face, he looked down at the fierce battle between Veronica, Mephisto, the Shire, Brando, and the others and Ko Hua. A cold smile appeared on his pale face, as if the previous depression had been swept away at this moment. But suddenly he felt his heart beating violently again. He hurriedly pressed his hand to his chest, his face full of cold sweat, as if he was receiving instructions. He nodded cautiously, nodded again, shook his head again, then frowned and finally nodded again. "I understand, Lord Ko Hua." "Yes." Finally, he muttered these 2 words as if to himself. Alaz and Medisha, who were hiding behind the crisscrossing cracks on the glacier, saw him pull out a dagger from his boot, and then began to carve and draw on the ice. After a short while, they saw clearly that he was drawing a circular magic circle. It should be Ko Hua who summoned him here. No wonder he could distinguish the maze-like path below, Medisha said in realization. "Sister Alaz, can you recognize what magic circle he is drawing?" "It seems to be a channeling magic circle." "A channeling magic circle?" Medisha saw the critical situation below and was nervous. She could not wait to summon her unicorn and fly down to fight side by side with Brando. But fortunately, she still knew what was more important. The Lord had not discovered a wreck at this place at all. It was easy to block an attack in the open but difficult to block an arrow in the dark. She had to restrain a wreck. You have seen those large-scale magic circles, such as the war teleportation circle of the Silver Elves. Large-scale magic circles cannot be activated by a person's magic alone. This kind of channeling magic circle is a kind of ritual circle that automatically gathers magic to activate the large-scale magic circle. Allah's eyes flashed with golden flames. She licked her sharp canine teeth with her tongue. I understand. Cruz's door of flame. The stolen materials must be on him. Ko Hua wants him to open the portal here and summon the demons to fight for her. We must not let him succeed. Medisha could not help but blurt out. Of course. The little female dragon sneered and nodded proudly. If she had a tail, it would be in the sky now. Arek panted as he finished drawing the first circle. However, for a large teleportation portal like the Door of Flame, one channeling circle was definitely not enough. He wiped off his sweat and walked to the side shakily, ready to start drawing the second circle. But it was at this time he saw a pair of shoes. To be exact, it was a pair of light brown calfskin boots. The tips of the boots were inlaid with iron and silver plated. He was very familiar with this pair of boots, because it was the owner of this pair of boots who took the heart of the dragon from him. He would never remember it wrong. He suddenly froze there. Keep drawing. The little female dragon's voice was smiling. Why did you stop drawing? I think your magic circle is not bad. Arek suddenly trembled as if he was possessed. He roared and pounced on Alaz. But the latter did not move, just looked at him with a smile. Before he could take 2 steps, he saw that his foot was tripped by something and fell solidly on the ice. Arek screamed, and then he felt something on his neck. He did not need to look back to know what it was, because he had already seen the long silver shuttle on his cheek. Human, do you feel very regretful now? The little female dragon was very proud. She simply put the star-shaped stone on the ground, then sat on it, and looked down at the battered Arek and said with a smile, but you can rest assured, your life will not be in danger for the time being. I will use you to make a deal, haha. Let's see what Brando will do now. The little female dragon was proud, but Medisha was not as optimistic. In fact, the little silver elf princess called out with some concern. Sister Alaz? What's wrong? Look over there. What? Is that the Black Knight over there? After Brando settled Hipamra, he did not directly return to the platform, but went around the crisscrossing pipes under the platform to the back of Dark Ko Hua. He knew that Ko Hua had automatically removed the divine barrier at this time, although her attack power had increased by 1,000 times, but her defense was greatly reduced. After all, the opponent was not a true god, and there was no real absolute gap in the true sense. And at this time Dark Ko Hua finally realized that there was one less person on the battlefield in front of her. She subconsciously looked back, but only saw the moment Brando's figure disappeared in that direction. At that moment she instinctively felt danger. As if subconsciously, the dense lightning quickly converged from the front half of the platform to the back half of the platform. Although even Ko Hua herself could not tell why she felt that Brando, who had just elemental activation, was more dangerous than the Sword Saint in the ultimate domain above her head. But after all, she was once a demigod, and now she had Milos's domain and priesthood. Her perception was 1,000 times sharper, and her premonitions were 1,000 times more accurate. Most gods believed in their own premonitions, just like how Martha could see the twilight of the gods and the world at the beginning of the creation of the world. The dense white light beams converged together like a wall of electricity, crackling and hitting the platform, forming dozens of dazzling golden lines in the entire back half of the platform, as if even the platform was about to melt. But these crisscrossing lightning bolts could not stop Brando. Everyone saw that Brando's figure was like a ghost, disappearing and reappearing continuously. The lightning passed through his figure, like passing through a broken phantom. In an instant, he had passed through the storm of lightning and arrived in front of Ko Hua. Previously, when Brando attacked the Shire, no one had noticed the subtle details on the battlefield, but at this moment it was no longer clear. Flash strike! Veronica almost blurted out, and in the ice cave Lenoret and Shido could not help but show a look of great surprise. Brando had already slashed his sword at Ko Hua, but at this time Dark Ko Hua breathed a sigh of relief. She stared coldly at Brando's sword that was getting closer and closer to her, and her tone was so cold that it was almost terrifying. The Dragon Clan's skill in manipulating space is also derived from the Twilight Clan, and you dare to show off in front of me." As soon as she finished speaking, countless bolts of lightning interweaved in front of her. It was as if even space itself was trembling, blocking Brando's sword. At that moment, Veronica, Lenoret, and Shido were all stunned. The flash strike sword art was blocked. This was almost unimaginable. Flame King Gretel's flash strike sword technique was a sword technique that was worshipped as a god in Kurletz. Once this technique was passed down from the Dragon Clan, its target would either be hit or dodge in the thousandth of a second after the blade appeared from a crack in space. There was almost no third possibility apart from that. However, right in front of them, the flash strike sword art was interrupted halfway. The space trembling amidst the thunderbolts was akin to the trembling souls of everyone present. What kind of strength was this? However, among all of them, only Brando could maintain his mentality. Although he was slightly surprised, he understood that the flash strike sword art was just a secret skill of the Dragon Clan. In fact, there was still a big gap between the Dragon Clan and the existence of Ekis' daughter. Therefore, he was not surprised that Ko Hua had the skill to counter the flash strike sword art. After all, the Dragon Clan and the Twilight Clan were old rivals. But just when everyone thought that he was going to return empty-handed, Brando suddenly retracted the Halran Gaia, and then slashed at Ko Hua again. Again! Dark Ko Hua could not help but laugh in anger when she saw that this guy did not know what was good for him. P.S. This is the first chapter at the end of the week. There will be another chapter around 20 o'clock. I wish everyone a good weekend. Chapter 835. Brando also circled to Ko Hua's side using the flash strike sword art technique, and heard a cold snort in his ear. Ko Hua seemed to have already captured his intentions. Her slender arm moved horizontally in the electric cocoon, turning in his direction. Her 5 fingers spread open, and hot white lines came from all directions, intertwining to form a round shield. Then she turned her head, her silver-white eyes only cold contempt as she looked at Brando with pity. Brando only smiled slightly. Dark Ko Hua was slightly startled and frowned. In Brando's hand, the Halran Gaia's blade was still moving forward. The black blade should have been blocked by the round shield woven by electric light, and it was. When the space trembled violently, the blade could not move an inch forward. But at the same time, everyone saw another scene. The black blade continued to move forward, slashing heavily into Ko Hua's shoulder. The latter screamed and crashed into the platform like a meteor falling to the ground. It was as if 2 events happened independently in 2 parallel worlds, happened separately, and then suddenly intertwined again. In the entire barrel-shaped canyon, the lightning that filled the sky disappeared completely. The white light that traveled in the air seemed to have never existed in this world. The long platform returned to calm, and it was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Dark Ko Hua got up from the ground and looked at Brando in shock and anger. Her left hand pressed on her snow-white shoulder, and blood kept seeping out from between her fingers. Brando saw this scene and understood that the other party was not a pure energy body. Her state was somewhat similar to Scarlet's, both of them being semi-energy bodies. However, Scarlet's semi-elementalization came from the power of the elements, and the power of Ekis' eldest daughter came from the power of Milos. In that case, it was just as he guessed. What just happened? Although the sword was on his neck, Philas did not seem to be afraid at all. He was still whispering to his fiancée. "It's the elements." Lorena felt her throat dry. "Count Tanagel's elements are..." Brando pursed his lips. He was still maintaining the same posture as when he struck the dark Ko Hua. He floated in the air and looked at the pitiful Ko Hua. There seemed to be fog lingering around him, but the golden threads of law flashed. "Time." Dark Ko Hua squeezed the word out of his mouth. "The most essential thing of all. Miss Ko Hua, if I'm not wrong, you have no resistance to elemental power, right?" Brando smiled and asked with confidence. Dark Ko Hua's face turned gloomy. She gritted her teeth and stared at Brando, not saying a word. "Because your own power hasn't recovered, you're borrowing Milo's power, right? But there's only one kind in the laws of the gods. Absolute disparity. So, you have both a priesthood and a domain, but these are just authorities. You can manipulate lightning and even use divine barriers, but those are just Milo's scepters. But before you truly become a god, it's impossible for you to obtain divine laws. So what? Dark Kohua asked in a low voice. Her voice was low, but Brando could hear the nervousness in her heart. If you were Milos, it wouldn't matter, because even if Milos wasn't the father of giants as part of the order, he himself represented some kind of law. Unfortunately, you're a dusk species. Creatures of chaos don't possess any laws. Brando smiled a little indifferently, but in the eyes of Dark Kohua, it was extremely abhorrent. He continued, "You should know what I'm going to say. Only laws can fight against laws because other forces are just dust in the mortal world." In the space, Brando and Kohua's voices rumbled, and Shido was also muttering to herself. "You're wrong about one thing." Dark Kohua's face was gloomy as she gritted her teeth and said, "There's not only the power of order in this world. Even order itself is just a manifestation of chaos, and chaos is also the top law." Brando nodded. "Indeed, in your heyday you naturally wouldn't care about us, but now you've just recovered, and you're just wearing Milo's shell. And even this shell has a fatal flaw for you. You must feel that it's a pity. If I had discovered it a little later, you would have been perfect." Dark Kohua was indeed furious. Lightning flashed in her platinum eyes. This was already the second time Brando had seen through her disguise. She didn't understand how he could always find her fatal weakness in the first place, but the repeated provocations finally made her furious. "You damn bastard!" But she knew that she couldn't do it. This human in front of her was complacent, and it was a perfect opportunity for her. Energy was flowing into her body, and in just a quarter of an hour, she would be completely reborn with the help of Milo's body's recovery. At that time, these guys in front of her would really be insects, but it was at this time that Dark Kohua felt a little strange. She stared at Brando, who was looking down at her from above, and felt that he should have seen through her thoughts. No, that's impossible. Otherwise, why didn't he do it? She pressed a hand on her shoulder, and a complicated light flashed in her eyes. She thought for a moment and was about to test the other party, but Brando smiled and interrupted her. "Are you wondering why I didn't follow up with another attack?" Dark Kohua seemed to have been hit in the heart by this sentence. The thing she was most worried about had happened. "It's actually very simple. My power is only enough for me to stab with my sword," Brando continued. "But fortunately, I'm not the only one here." Brando's words made Dark Kohua's mind flustered. She suddenly felt the hair on her back stand up. She quickly turned her head and saw a gray blade. The blade moved forward silently, bringing along a gray domain as it moved forward quietly, as if it was sucking in all the sounds around it. Gray element. She immediately recognized that it was the attack method of the human sword saint. Although the opponent's element was not as vicious as Brando's time, his strength, the ultimate domain, made her very wary. Just as Brando said, she had no way to resist the power of the law. She had no choice but to roll awkwardly to avoid the Ash Sword Saint's sword. But her dodge proved Brando's words. Kohua herself obviously knew this. When she got up from the platform, her face was as black as iron. Once Mephisto seized the opportunity, Dark Kohua had no chance to summon lightning. Without the shell of Milos's authority, how could she, who had just recovered, be a match for the Ash Sword Saint? In fact, if it weren't for her rich combat experience, she would have been nailed to the platform. Veronica, who saw this scene, turned back with strong curiosity in her eyes. "How did you guess?" In fact, the reason was very simple. When this dungeon was opened, the players had not yet activated the concept of elemental activation. If the boss in this dungeon could control the elements, then the players of that era would not have been able to win. Only the law can fight against the law. Other powers are but dust in the world. This sentence was the title of the chapter on elemental activation, and was also the core of the law of Tiamat. Brando remembered it deeply, and with this preconceived idea, with the result and the deduction process, and observing Dark Kohua's various performances, it was not difficult to find the answer. Previously, it was too easy for Master's Grey Realm to destroy her lightning. The Grey Realm is not a superior law, at least not higher than the lightning element. And Master's strength, compared to her now, is only about the same, so it aroused my suspicion. Brando replied. "That's it?" Veronica looked a little doubtful. It was not that she had any suspicions, but she instinctively felt that this little guy would not tell her so straightforwardly. "That's it." Brando nodded firmly. Veronica was silent for a moment, then shook her head with a bitter smile. Little guy, I really don't know if it was good or bad to let you stay in the loop of trade winds. Although she is not a true god now, the title of a false god can't be wrong. An existence close to a god, but a few words from you have turned her into this. I really don't know what to say about you. Brando smiled and shook his head. The battle is not over yet, Lady Veronica. Ko Hua is Ekka's eldest daughter. She will not admit defeat so easily. What else can she do? Veronica narrowed her eyes suspiciously. She is not a god yet, only the law can fight against the law. In addition to the priesthood, she has another authority of Milos. Brando stared at Ko Hua, who was fighting with Mephisto below, and said word by word, "Domain." As if to prove Brando's words, the dark Ko Hua suddenly screamed in anger. In an instant, a light blue electrostatic field with her body as the center expanded in an instant and shrouded the entire canyon. It was like an expanding ripple, but when this expanding ripple swept across everyone present, everyone felt that their connection with the original world was cut off. The feeling was as if they were still in their original position, and the scenery around them did not change at all, but they felt that they had come to another world. Brando, Mephisto, the Shire, Veronica, and Hippamera, who was lying on the pipe under the platform, felt it the most obvious. This is. The Shire's eyes were a little bright. A world formed by the law of thunder. Veronica closed her eyes and felt it carefully. Although it does not belong to Ko Hua's law, but it is indeed so. She wants to use Milo's law to offset the advantage of our elements. Brando had already seen through Ko Hua's trick, or rather, the opponent's means were within his expectations. The third phase has begun, Madame Veronica. The next step is up to you. What third phase? The female commander of the crew's army was a little startled. Nothing, madam, you should be the fastest in this situation, please deal with those pipes. Brando shook his head. I have to help the teacher. You. Veronica looked at him suspiciously. Will it be okay? Brando paused for a moment. Then he replied, It better be okay. The entire space in the canyon was like a prison, completely shrouded in an electrostatic field. Light blue fragments of light floated in the air, and on the platform it was a different scene. Mephisto's gray realm no longer had the absolute advantage, but was suppressed by the light blue light to a very small area. He stabbed at Ko Hua with his sword, and the latter seemed to have regained the ability to fight back. She raised her bloody left hand, and a circle of ripples appeared on her open fingertips. The gray sword saint's sword seemed to have hit the divine barrier again, and stopped in midair. Mephisto frowned slightly. Corphus' counterattack didn't give him the feeling of a shield, but more like it stopped his sword automatically. But the sword was still in his hand, and this feeling was too strange. At this time, Brando landed beside him and stood side by side. What's going on? Mephisto asked. Brando shook his head. He only knew that they should be in Milos's realm, but he had never really come into contact with a god's realm. The only thing he had come into contact with that was probably the law realm that was created after elemental activation to the extreme planes. In the extreme planes, one's own elemental power would be strengthened thousands of times, while the enemy's elemental power would be weakened thousands of times. If possible, everyone would try their best to avoid entering the enemy's domain to fight. Ko Hua's realm was similar. At least from his point of view, Mephisto's gray realm was greatly suppressed. But what made him feel strange was that Ko Hua's realm was Milos's, and her own power actually represented chaos before the fusion, which meant that in this realm, her own power would also be suppressed. But now it seemed that she was not suppressed at all. She even floated back to the platform, looking at him with a venomous gaze. What's going on? Brando was a little puzzled, because he felt that Dark Ko Hua's fusion with this realm was very harmonious. But Dark Ko Hua obviously did not intend to give him a chance to think. His previous performance had made her very wary. She raised her hand and gently pointed at the air in front of her. When Algar's dragon soared in the sky, Jupiter put shackles on their wings after the north wind. From then on, the sky was cut off from these lowly creatures. Pale poem? Brando was slightly startled, not quite understanding what Ko Hua meant by suddenly reciting this paragraph. He subconsciously turned his head, but saw the Shire, Veronica, and Mephisto standing there stiffly, as if time had been frozen motionless. Brando's expression changed drastically, and he suddenly realized what Dark Ko-Hua was doing, word of truth. But what kind of word of truth could make an existence of the ultimate realm, a sword saint at the peak of the law, submit in an instant? Word of truth itself was just a manifestation of the law. Logically speaking, as long as one stepped into the elemental activation, this spell would basically have no effect. But Ko-Hua's current actions had clearly subverted Brando's understanding. Word of truth? How can you still move? The two opened their mouths to question each other at the same time. But Ko-Hua's eyes suddenly flashed with a light, and she reacted. So that's how it is. You really are a divine. I know who you are. She paused for a moment and replied gloomily, Odin, I'm right. You've got the wrong person. Brando replied with a straight face. What a joke, with so many people around, how could he admit it? It doesn't matter if you don't admit it. Ko-Hua snorted coldly. But you can't fool anyone. Only a divine has such authority, and can even ignore the domain of the gods. But unfortunately, Odin and the other bastard bloodlines, as the last generation, can bully mortals, but it's meaningless in a battle of our level. Very soon you will understand that in my world, only my rules exist. Brando was slightly startled, but the former had already pointed her finger at him and shouted. Alphonse once saw everything with his own eyes in the final battle. On the battlefield of Babel, when thousands of troops rushed towards him, he understood that an era was over. It was Pale Poem again. But this time Brando was already alert. He immediately took a step back and clenched Haurangaya tightly. But it was at this moment that a miracle happened. He found that he was still standing on the platform, but he felt that the distance between him and Dark Ko-Hua was widening. It seemed that a vast plain was suddenly formed between them. At the end of his vision there was a towering cliff on the horizon, and Ko-Hua was standing on the cliff looking down at him. And behind her, under the cliff, dense flags were appearing on the plain. Brando recognized the emblems on those flags at a glance: winter wolves, frost leaves, ice blades. Those were the legendary tribes of the frost giants. He seemed to understand what was happening at once. At the end of his vision, the army of frost giants was appearing. He didn't know how to describe what was happening in front of his eyes. The two of them were still on the platform and they could feel it, but what they saw was an army approaching in an instant thousands of meters away from the Dark Korfa. Although this scene looked very strange, Brando understood that what he saw was probably not an illusion, but a scene that was really happening in this world of lightning. This was Milos's kingdom, the Storm Plain, the hometown of the frost giants. But why could Ko-Hua use Milos's domain? Shouldn't her own law be chaos? P.S. The second chapter has been delivered. Begging for some monthly vote.